The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
I'd like to call the committee to order for this special session of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee to consider the BBC's annual report. The session this afternoon will be in two parts. The first panel covering the annual report, and then we will have a second panel which Lord Hall will also be on, where we'll be asking some questions relating to the committee's inquiry on reality television. Just to note as well, for regular watchers of the committee, we have two new faces around the table this afternoon. Lee Rowley, who is with us from the Public Accounts Committee, using the new guesting rules that the House has, which allows members of other committees to guest onto the another committee if it's doing something of similar relevant work. So we're grateful to have Lee here. And also Philip Davis, who has been elected to the committee in place of Rebecca Powell. And Philip, I know you're no stranger to the Select Committee, but as you're now formally back on it, I wonder if I could ask you just to confirm any interest you have for the record.
Yes, I don't know if it's not particularly relevant for today's session, but I refer people to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. There's nothing outside of that that's relevant.
Okay, we have two members of the committee who also in receipt in part of BBC pensions. Despite that, they still carry on working for a living, which is very good of them.
I've corrected the idea. I'm not actually in receipt. Okay. They look like it.
If I could ask Gillian Knight and Brendan O'Hara just to confirm their interest for the record.
Yeah, I'm not in receipt, but
I will, I hope, at some point be.
Yes, ditto. I'm a BBC deferred pension holder.
Thank you. If we can start to the questions for this afternoon. We want to start off, probably not surprisingly, by discussing the BBC's consultation on over-75s licence fees and the decision that the BBC has taken so far. I wonder if I could start off, just for the benefit of the committee, in just going back to the agreement that was reached between the BBC and the government in the first place, back in July 2015. I see from the BBC's records that the BBC was briefed by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on 29th of June 2015 that the government intended to ask the BBC to take on full responsibility for the over-75s licence fees. and the agreement was announced on the 6th of July. I see the BBC Trust Board met on 5 occasions, a combination of meetings and conference calls during that period of time. When did the BBC Executive Board meet during that period, Lord Hall?
I can't recall, but what I can say, at the beginning of the week in question, I had a call from the then Secretary of State, John Whittingdale, saying, basically, I've lost the argument over the weekend. This was the first I knew about it. And they're going to impose the over-75s concession on you, at which point I said, well, that's nuclear, and I then laid out the consequences of that decision. And then I just remember a series of meetings, and I can't give you the details of them, but I'm very happy to, if that would be helpful. I mean, to my mind, what is really interesting, 2 days ago, Ed Vasey, who was there at the time, and we talked a lot to, said very clearly in the Westminster Hall debate, this policy was forced on the BBC by the government, by the Treasury. There was no negotiation. The BBC was going to take the over-75s licence whether it liked it or not. The only room for negotiation was what the BBC might be able to claw back. And if you remember, we claw back. This is why I feel very, very strongly that this mustn't happen again. It happened in 2010, exactly the same way, over a period of a few days, behind closed doors. Nobody knew anything about it, just a few people negotiating something as fundamental as this. And it happened again in 2015, which is why I think when we come to 21, 22, the next time the licence fee is negotiated, that needs to be in plain sight with parliamentary involvement, with the licence fee payers involved, and in a way which allows a proper debate about the BBC's funding to take place, because it couldn't take place in this time.
Well, as you know, the committee agree with you on that. But I'm just quite interested to know what the debate was within the BBC at the time, and how the decision was made to accept the government's offer. Because, as I said, the trust board met either in person or by conference call on 5 occasions. There's no record that the executive board met at all. There is, in the published list of minutes for the executive board, there was a meeting in early June, and then there was a meeting on the 7th of July, the day after the decision had been taken. Interestingly, in the minutes of the 7th of July, it says that the Executive Board approved the minutes of a meeting that had taken place on the 29th of June, but there is no published record for that meeting. So could I ask whether the BBC could check whether there was indeed an Executive Board meeting on that day?
I mean, it was a small subcommittee of the Executive Board meeting with me, doing the negotiation. The final lap of the negotiation was done with the chairman of the BBC Trust. In the end, any agreement had to be done by the BBC Trust, not by us, and that happened, if I recall, on the Saturday evening of the week in question, and then the announcement was made again, if I recall, on the Tuesday. The key thing in this period, Chair, was as I think Ed Vasey made very clear in his statement on a couple of days ago.
I think we'll come back to Ed Vasey.
But it's important.
I'm interested in what you think about this, not what Ed Vasey thinks. Great respect to a much esteemed colleague. So,
what I was going to say was what we got back by concessions against the... But
we can do this, I think, through questions and answers, okay? Is that there was a crucial period. There was on the 29th, the BBC was briefed, and as you say, there was some concern that this could be introduced immediately and with no further concessions. The government then made concessions which were discussed at a conference call on the 4th of July, the Saturday, where it was confirmed that the government would allow the licence fee to go up in line with inflation, which is something the BBC had asked for, that it would end the top slicing of the licence fee to fund broadband investment, and then also that it would close what's called the iPlayer loophole.
That's right.
And those issues were discussed in this conference call on the 4th of July. And the minutes of that conference call saying that the Director General agreed that he would recommend the deal to his executive board, but advised the Chancellor that the Trust position was that it would not oppose the agreement but would not endorse the process. So what I don't see, though, is you actually referred that back to the Executive Board for a decision before you agreed to it.
We had a small team, again as I recall, of the Executive Board that were negotiating with the Chancellor and keeping the Trust informed of what was going on. And the key decision makers in the end had to be the Trust, and they met on that Saturday. Indeed, the chairman of the Trust was with me when we went to see the Chancellor, as I recall, on that Saturday morning.
But the Trust position the official position of the Trust was neutral. It wasn't. It said it wouldn't. The minutes say quite clearly that the trust gives no. It won't oppose it, but nor does it endorse the decision either.
Well, the trust did endorse the decision because in the end they were the body that was responsible for the entire BBC. As I recall, Rona Fairhead was involved in that final meeting, or a meeting, anyway, with the Chancellor, and the trust was, as I recall, on Saturday evening, did endorse the settlement as it was put to them.
Well, it says the trust minister on that you say that it would not oppose the agreement, but would not endorse the process. So that's the trust, because the trust has not endorsed it, and the executive board hasn't endorsed it either because it hasn't met. And to me, it looks like the only two people that agreed with this were you and Rona Fairhead.
Well, Rona Fairhead was the chair of the trust. It was perfectly proper for her to agree to it. But that's not my recollection of what happened. My recollection absolutely was me talking to Rona and Rona having a series of calls with the trust and the trust agreeing to it late on Saturday night, as I recall.
Yeah, but some of those, I mean, I'm just going off, I wasn't there, I'm just going off of the published minutes on that the BBC's published. So this is a really big decision that it's discussed with the trust board, but the trust board won't make a decision. Let's say it's neutral on it. And the executive board isn't called to meet. So you may have had private meetings with the individuals on the board, but you never sought the formal consent of your board before agreeing to it.
Can I say, of course everybody agreed to it. I mean, because that was then announced 2 days later by the government. But can I just make one other point to you? And I'm sorry to quote Ed Vasey, but he is the person who was there as I was. This was a process that was going to happen anyway. The notion that somehow we had any possibility of not accepting the over-75s is risible. They were coming at us with that. It was going to happen. The key thing, as has been made clear by me and others who were involved in this, was how we could negotiate the best possible deal for the BBC, which is what we did. And can I say, that was tough. It was really, really hard going. And we negotiated things which we felt could counterbalance the over-75s.
Yeah, all I'm saying, though, is in terms of this was a fairly major decision for the BBC. And there doesn't seem to be in the minutes either of the executive board or of the trust any indication of a formal agreement to it. That the trust position is neutral and the executive board didn't meet. And what does seem strange is the executive board met to discuss it the day after it agreed and had been published. And all the minutes really do there is note the fact the decision had been made.
This is a trust decision. The trust was set up to be the governing body of the BBC. I actually communicated directly with Rona Fairhead as chairman of the trust. I was reporting into her. I made it very clear to the Chancellor of the Exchequer this was a trust decision. I'd done my bit there with what I felt was the right thing to do. It was a trust decision, in the end, to say yay or nay.
But based on the minutes, what the trust are acting on the fact that you're saying as Director General, and this is a commercial decision, ultimately affects the BBC's budgets and spending in a significant way. That you're saying that you agreed you would recommend the deal to the executive board. So the trust don't necessarily, you're saying that, but the trust are never told that it's gone to the executive board have agreed it, they've agreed they can make this work, and therefore we're asking you to rubber stamp it. That was never part of this process.
Can I say, this is one of the reasons you're pointing out here why this process must not happen this way again, because there's not enough time or proper thinking time to do these things properly, and you pointed that out very, very clearly. But can I just say, in the end, the final decision had to be by the trust. I didn't have the authority to take that on my own. It had to be by the trust, and that's exactly what happened.
But you complained rightly that this thing was done behind closed doors and without proper scrutiny and proper process. Indeed, one of the criticisms of the trust was there's no opportunity to ask licence fee payers what they think about this decision. But you didn't even ask your own board.
No, I was negotiating with key people on the board. We talked. But actually, the formality of this is with the trust. I don't see why that's so difficult to understand. That's the trust of the people in the end who had to say yay or nay.
But if you're complaining it's done behind closed doors, and yet even your own executive board were not fully consulted before the decision was made.
But can I just go back to the problem, as opposed to looking at all sorts of minutes and all that sort of stuff?
No.
Can I just explain?
With respect, Lord Hall.
Yeah.
The reason I think this is important is that you started off criticising the process.
Yes.
What I'm trying to do is, we understand the government's process, I think, and we've been critical of that as a committee. Yeah. We're just trying to understand what the BBC's process was for agreeing what was a fairly important decision. So
the process was me negotiating with a small team of executives. At one point, Rona Fairhead, as chairman of the trust, coming along to a meeting with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and one or two others, and then me saying to her, as chairman of the trust, this is what I am recommending. We've won these concessions, but you need to say it's okay or not.
So in the final meeting of the trust on the 6th of July, the day the announcement was made, in their minutes, it says the Director General and the Executive would work to develop a strategic plan so the BBC was ready to live within the new financial parameters and deliver the further savings and changes to its services which will be required in the next charter period. So that would suggest that the BBC Trust had been reassured by you that you could make this work.
Well, we were absolutely clear with the upsides and the downsides of this. The upsides were inflation for the first time in a decade, getting rid of the broadband levy, as you said, and also plugging the iPlayer loophole, which the government didn't actually fully do, and keeping us in play for the charter negotiations, which we were in the middle of. One bit of context I just want you to understand, and I'm sure you do, which is this was a matter of weeks or a couple of months into a new Conservative government, a majority Conservative government, at a time of the height of austerity, and we were making judgments about what seemed appropriate at the time in the height of that austerity, and that's why we were able to say, yes, we recommend this, but the policy for the over-75s is coming to us. The government have given us that, and as John Whittingdale has made absolutely clear in his statements, because he also was there at the time, they knew and we knew that that meant reform as long as we could consult and go through the proper processes.
But if I was a member of the BBC Trust at that time, or if I was a member of the Trust Board and I'd been in that meeting, I would imagine, reassured to know that you thought you could make this work, that you thought with the concessions that have been negotiated from the government that this would work, this plan would work. And indeed, I mean, whether the Trust knew this hadn't even gone to the full executive board, I don't know. But certainly the impression in the meeting was you thought you could make this work. And then indeed that day, you said in an interview, this quotes from the BBC Online report, you said about the deal, far from being a cut, the way this financial settlement is shaped gives us effectively flat licence fee income across the first 5 years of the next charter.
That's right.
And so and then when you appeared in front of the Select Committee that autumn, you said that this was actually a better financial settlement than the licence fee settlement had been 5 years before.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Let me explain why. The 2010 settlement, which was done in exactly the same way and the wrong way, but I'll leave that aside, effectively took 24% out of the BBC's budget if you take the 24% as what the BBC's budget would have been had it gone up in line with inflation. The budget at the end of that period was 24% less because we took on the cost of the World Service, we took on the cost of BBC monitoring, we took on a large proportion of the cost of S4C, and we also took on the government's then idea of regional television. All of that meant that rather than rising in line with inflation, the BBC's budget at the end of that period was 24% down. That was the stark reality of 2010 settlement. What we were doing, and I'll explain maybe the things that we got wrong in that assessment, was saying that it would be a broad, flat cash settlement over the period of 5 years. Now, what we didn't take into consideration, because life kind of moves on, one, it was CPI, but on a proportion of the BBC's budget. Because, of course, it wasn't CPI on the whole budget, because part of that is money coming from the government to pay for the licence fee concession. Secondly, inflation, and this in some ways is a good thing, but not for us, in the media has been much higher than CPI. That's because of the tax credits and so on, Netflixes and others coming into this country, and that's led to our costs going up more than we should. And the government didn't plug the iPlayer loophole in the way they said they would, which meant we only got half the money coming in. It was always assumed we would look at the over-75s. John Whittingdale made that clear in what he's been saying, and we would look at that as well. We would take on the policy, I have to say really unwillingly, but it was coming and we couldn't do anything about it, and actually consult and then decide what was best from the BBC's point of view for both the licence fee payers who are over 75 and those below. That was the...
But I think at the time, I mean, regardless of how the process was run, and we've been critical of that, it looks like that there's been a negotiation between the BBC. You've won some concessions from the government. The government's got you to agree to take on responsibility for the over-75s. You've broadly welcomed the settlement as being a good settlement and better than the previous settlement. And you've briefed the BBC Trust Board that the executive is going to come up with a strategy to make this work. And I don't see any indication here that this was not an obligation you were going to honour or intended to honour. It looks like actually you're quite satisfied with the obligations that the BBC has taken on.
Absolutely.
But there's nothing in the minutes that says that.
Absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. We were taking on the policy of the over-75s. And I want to be quite clear about this. At the time, I was clear with the then-Chancellor. I remember exactly his words to me, which were, you and I are going to have to go out there and socialise this policy because it's going to be very difficult for you. John Whittingdale has made it absolutely clear in what he said in the Commons. I made it very clear when I came before this committee, and you mentioned it in the autumn of that year, when I think it was John Nicholson who said to me, So what sort of reforms will you be looking at? I said, I can't say at the moment. We'll have to work that out over the next few years. And John Nicholson, the late John Nicholson of this committee then said to me, what about means testing? And I said, I'm not saying there could be, I'm not saying there can't be. That's what we've got to work out. Completely consistent about the reforms that we would need to make were we to live within the budget parameters set. Now, the consultation could have gone another way, and we could have ended up not being allowed to make those changes. But the policy came to us, and we have carried that out to the letter from the Digital Economy Act onwards. We've carried out that consultation thoroughly, and we've come to a very difficult, balanced discussion. If you want to ask who should take on responsibility, from the beginning, it's the government who was withdrawing the concession, and we had no choice whatsoever other than to take that on, and that's clear to me.
What I'm saying is, when you look at the minutes of the BBC meetings at this time, what you see on the original proposal, what the BBC is saying is very much what it's saying now, which is that if we take on this hit, the over-75s there'll be closures of services, there'll be massive cuts.
That's right.
Then you get the concessions that you asked for, and the position then seems to be, okay, well, we will try and make this work. The concessions make a big difference, and you actually say it ends up being a battle financial settlement for. There's nothing at that time to indicate that this is an impossible task that you've taken on, that you must inevitably withdraw from.
I'm really sorry, but I said at the time we would have to reform the over-75s to make this work. Now, you know, the policy of that we've gone through the consultation might have stopped us doing that, but that was absolutely central to me saying to people, this is a settlement that we can live with. But let me also be clear, I said then, taking the over-75s policy, dumping it on the BBC was not a way to run a railroad.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is that is not reflected in the minutes of the meetings you attended at the time. And if you felt that strongly about it, I think it's odd that you accepted this without even consulting formally the BBC Executive Board.
Yeah, I was consulting all the time with the BBC's executive board. I mean, that week is seared on my mind. Yeah. I remember constantly talking with the executive board, but formally it was the BBC Trust who had to say yes or no.
I just want to come on to the value of the concessions as well, because I think these have been slightly sort of tossed away as being sort of insignificant, and in many ways the language that the BBC uses in the consultation document that was published in June goes back to the way the BBC talked about this before the concessions were made, as if this is a flat £700 million, you know, we're going to have to massively cut services. But it was and you may have more up-to-date figures, but at the time, around the time the iPlayer loophole was going to be closed, it was believed that would be worth around 150 million a year. It was believed that the cost of the top slicing to pay for broadband was about 130 million a year. If you'd looked at the value of the increases in licence fee that would come, that would have been about £200 million a year, but you'd be better off by the time the over-75s came in. And then when you add on to that the fact, as you have in your own annual reports, that in the last year you've made 153 million worth of efficiencies, and your revenue, direct revenue, sort of dividend, if you like, from BBC Studios has increased by £59 million a year. So as a bundle, and you may query those numbers, that ends up being about £700 million that's been found. But certainly the value that you got back from the closing the loophole from the iPlayer and from ending top slicing and from the increase in the licence fee would seem to be greater than the £250 million obligation you're prepared to take on for the over-75s. If anything, it would seem that you are net gainers from this process, given your current policy of not honouring the original agreement, but means testing the over-75s.
Can I just say, the idea we are not honouring the original agreement is wrong, and I really refute that, and I resent it. We absolutely are honouring the agreement we came to with George Osborne and John Whittingdale to the T. So, honestly, if you want to come out and say things like you're not honouring the agreement, you are wrong. No, this is absolutely crucial that I establish this, because, you know, we are carrying out what the government said we should do to the T. Now, to answer your point about the concessions back, CPI, as I explained earlier, given the amount of inflation there is in media, which is higher than CPI, given the fact it wasn't carried out over the entirety of our budget, is an issue.
In cash terms, how much? What does that mean?
So there's an issue which it is not keeping up with our costs. The iPlayer loophole, which you said was, we estimated somewhere around 140, 150 million, the government didn't fill it in quite as we wanted. They only did it from the point of view of the BBC usage of the iPlayer. This meant that that was actually short by the tune of 45, to the tune rather of 45 million, not the 140 or 150 that you were estimating it to be. So in all sorts of ways, we brought in less from these reforms than we thought. And that's life. At the time, it looked like we would do fine out of it, but it's not turned out that way.
So what do you think, do you have a figure, or perhaps you could get back to the committee with a figure for what in actual terms you think the benefit of those concessions that you won were?
Well, that's why we put a figure of 250 on what we think we should be doing to support the over-75s concession in the way that we've interpreted it as a board.
No, so sorry, what I was asking was, those three concessions that were won by the BBC in the negotiation that we've just discussed, the iPlayer loophole, the top ending of top slicing and increasing by inflation, consumer prices, the licence fee, what in reality has that been worth to the BBC, or will that be worth by the time we
can happily come back with those figures.
Because I mean, as I said, I'm working on figures that have been quoted at the time, but these were at the time the decisions were being made.
I mean, what we can do, I mean, there are assumptions at the time. My point is just, is there are assumptions at the time, but those assumptions have not worked out as we thought, which is.
But I think that is a perfectly reasonable position, but I think it also reflects the fact that at the time in 2015, you might have been slightly more bullish about the ability to get this through without having to put through a very significant means testing. I mean, you're looking to get rid of 2/3 of the obligation, because these figures may well have presented themselves in a more favourable light, in which case the money would have been there, it would have offset the obligations you'd have taken on, certainly to within a reasonable level, but it hasn't worked out that way. No. And so I think whilst it's understandable that you're critical of the government for putting you in the position where you felt you had no choice, I think you also entered into it thinking that you could deliver it, and it's turned out not to be the case.
We entered into it thinking that if we could reform, and that's a big question because we had to go through a consultation and it might have gone the other way, and if other things to do with CPI or to do with inflation in the meat industry and other things actually worked out okay, we could probably get through. That's what we thought. Now, as you've been just suggesting, life doesn't work out like that.
Yeah. But I think I think what would be interesting to know against the background of this very significant decision that's being taken, because you're right, you are right to say that it was always the case that there would be an agreement that the BBC would be free to consult and change the over-75s policy. The obligated, the agreement runs to 2020, and after that you've got freedom to act. My contention, as we've already discussed, is that I don't think at the moment the decision was made and in your immediate pronouncements on it, it was clear that such a significant change would be made. There was nothing to suggest that you would need to find 2/3 of that cost elsewhere, and you'd only fund about 250 million of it. And I think it's important to understand against the 250 million pounds you're asking pensioners to pay for the licence fee, how much was the value you got from the extra concessions that you won?
I get that, and I think what my retort to you is, I think at the time we thought we wouldn't need as much as we do now, which I think is what you're saying because of a number of things that have gone against us.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Gillian Knight.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I've just been struck, frankly, by what use of words such as going nuclear. You were sort of tapping the table when you came in, obviously very emotional, very angry. You were sort of pent up almost with rage in this deal. But then the words that were read out by the Chair before, at the time, spoken by yourself. You said it was the right deal in difficult economic circumstances. Far from bringing a cut, the way this financial settlement is shaped gives effectively flat licence fee income across the first 5 years of the next charter. So what is it? Did you misunderstand the implications of what you were agreeing to? Or did you mislead in that statement? Which is the case?
No, I didn't misunderstand, and I certainly didn't mislead Mr. Knight. I think the Chairman has been probing in exactly the same direction as I'll answer you now. At the time, if you go back to what it was like in 2015, people were getting but flat cash minus settlements. At that time, having a cash flat settlement felt a proper settlement for the BBC, no matter the fact it shouldn't have been done that way. What's happened since then is that some things have not turned out as we expected, and that is, I suppose, that's.
So you got your numbers wrong, basically.
No, we didn't get our numbers wrong. I don't think we could have understood that one, the government would not actually do the proper deal it should have done over the iPlayer loophole. I think we did underrate the amount of inflation that was going to come into the media sector. We didn't reckon at that time quite the inflation that would come from Netflix and others.
Businesses across the country deal with inflation all the time.
No, but,
but
inflation in our costs, which is much more than CPI, is
But the health service has to deal with above CPI inflation costs. A lot of businesses, a lot of public sector and private sector have to deal with this. This isn't just like news, so to speak. I mean, the realities are that you were presented with a deal at that particular time. You chose to accept that deal, and then you actually said in public that you agreed that it was okay.
Yes, and can I say...
That's what you said in public, and here you are a couple of years later, you're now saying, no, I'm sorry, but actually this is not something that we can live with at all.
No, you're wrong. It's 4.5 years on. But also, let me not be bad, but also, what's happened since then is we have done the reforms which we said was absolutely on the table then for the over-75s concession. We've made it clear, and we've made clear the financial parameters for that. The other thing which is really important at the time is this. We also needed to keep in play the negotiations going on about the Charter, because we went straight from that into a very heated debate, which I'm sure you'll recall, about the scope and scale of the BBC. We were under huge pressure to have a charter which would last 3 or 4 years, and where the licence fee would not be guaranteed for that amount of time. So we were in constant dialogue here, and by the end of that summer, we'd got, if I recall it was in that summer, it might have been slightly later, we had a charter for 11 years, everyone was saying it'd be 3 or 4 years, and we had the licence fee at the centre of the way the BBC would be funded for all that time. Those were also considerable wins in this period of our negotiations.
Okay, so effectively, it was a negotiation, and it was a quid pro quo. And this is how it seemed to have worked at the time. And that is effectively the Treasury got its pound of flesh by putting this onto yourselves in terms of the over-75s licence fee. But you also got, against quite sort of strong opposition within certain parts of Parliament, you got a very long charter agreement, you got a very good deal on that side of things. But you got a good deal there, and yet here you are now, effectively, as you say, time afterwards, turning around and saying, well, I'm sorry, but actually the part of the negotiation which we weren't happy about, we were held our feet to the fire. Well, a lot of the world could just say tough, frankly. They could just say, well, you were actually, if that's the case, you lost out in that terms of that negotiation against the money, and you are no different now than the chief executive who has got their numbers wrong and is now issuing a profits warning.
No, I mean, well, thank you for saying that we seem to get a lot back from the negotiation. I mean, because I agree with Mr. Knight on that. No, what I'm just trying to establish is that as part of that settlement in 2015 with the then Chancellor of the Exchequer agreed with the Trust, it was absolutely clear that reform of the over-75s, provided we could go through the proper consultation and provided the consultation backed us up, was on the table. Everybody knew that reform was likely. Not inevitable, but likely.
Okay, but so why is it now that you're so saying that effectively this was such a terrible deal, that this was something that basically you are now saying effectively you're effectively whinging and trying to effectively say that this is something which was absolutely appalling. Was it awful? The government has managed to really force us into this position. You got a really good thing back as well. You got the extended charter.
We got the extended charter, which I think from the BBC's future and independence was almost the most important thing. I'm not a whinger, and I promise you I'm absolutely not whinging. I'm just trying to point out the facts, and the facts were that the government withdrew the concession. They withdrew the funding we were getting for that concession, and the government at that time absolutely knew that reform was in the air, and quite likely. Now, it might not have happened because the consultation might have gone the other way, but they knew it was there.
Why should any government in the future trust anything the BBC says to it when it shakes hands on a deal?
Because
and when 4 years later it comes in and it says effectively, that you have, you have forced us through your negotiations. You have effectively put us into a position which is untenable. This, and then, frankly, gets BBC reporters or BBC presenters, also outside organisations as well, to lobby, and then effectively brings huge pressure to bear on the government of the day when it struck a deal with the government, and it should hold itself to that deal.
Can I say, can I just repeat what is the truth? and that is that you can trust the BBC. We entered into a deal. I mean, I agree unwillingly. I'd rather we didn't have the over-75s, but nonetheless, we took it because we knew that was coming, and others who were involved have said you couldn't have stopped it. It was going to happen. But we took it knowing that reform was on the table. That was absolutely clear from the Chancellor and from the then Secretary of State. They've made that clear. Or the Secretary of State has made that clear in what he said. We have done nothing other than abide by what the government then did. The government brought in the Digital Economy Act. The Digital Economy Act said from June of next year, you take over the policy, but you must have a full consultation process before then. We've carried that out, and we've come to a hard but nonetheless difficult decision. I can see nothing in that which is not utterly trustworthy and utterly what we were committed to, and we said the government were committed to way back in 2015.
Well, I think the issue is that effectively you made those statements in when the deal was done, that this is actually a good thing, etc. And now here we are, a few years later, and you're saying effectively, well, actually it wasn't a good deal. Poor us, our feet were held to the fire like you wouldn't believe. This is an appalling thing, and yet. You actually shook hands on that deal.
Yes.
And here's the BBC. So next time around, is this what happens next time around if we do actually have another charter renewal?
Mr. Knight, I think we are agreeing, presumptuous of me to say so, you as a committee and myself are agreeing on one thing, and that is this is not a way to conduct a negotiation. That's what I feel really strongly about, because actually to do these negotiations at such speed, behind closed doors, without any scrutiny at all from Parliament, or debate in Parliament, or debate among licensee payers. I mean, I look at the consultation we've just done, and I think it's been thorough. It's involved 190,000 people. It's involved lots of other people. My hope is that together we can find a way for when it comes to 21, 22, we do this in public. We have an argument about the scope and the scale of the BBC in public. I believe that this country needs the BBC more now than it has ever done in the past against fake news, globally, for soft power, in terms of new talent in this country. I really, and in terms of talking to local and regions talking to themselves, I think that the need is really there. That should be a proper debate, therefore, about the quantum to fund that, which didn't happen in 2010, and it hadn't happened in 2015.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Ian Lucas.
There was a general election in 2017. There was a Conservative Party election manifesto commitment to maintain benefits for pensioners. Did you consider reopening this issue after a Conservative government was re-elected?
We asked the government quite why the manifesto didn't reflect the powers that they had given to us, and I don't have a satisfactory answer. But they knew, and we knew, that as of June of next year, the powers came to us, and there was never any. There's nothing from government that said that's not the case.
So, after the general election, you contacted the government.
Yes.
To clarify the position.
Yes.
In writing.
Yes, we wrote to them, and we wrote to them at the time to say, what does this mean?
And that was because of the manifesto commitment.
Yes, and because it seemed at best odd to us that you'd have a manifesto commitment that was completely at odds with what the law had just determined was the case, namely that, and Parliament had decided, namely that the concession would come to us from June of next year, and we'd consult and so on.
Could we have that correspondence, please?
I'm sure whatever correspondence we've got, we can give to you, yes.
Because I think it's odd too. I think the manifesto commitment should be respected. I've got a constituent whose name is Ted Edwards, who's 93 years of age, and he's a Normandy veteran, and he's spoken to me about this issue of veterans, and Normandy veterans in particular, having a benefit removed. I mean, Ted is a wonderful community activist. He is someone who contributes hugely to his community. My father was also a Normandy veteran who landed on Gold Beach. I've come to know you, Lord Hall. It doesn't sit right with me that we are withdrawing benefits from such people. Will you reconsider the position?
Well, the board has taken a position, and let me first of all say I understand the position that Mr. Edwards finds himself in. I respect completely what he's done and with his life. I mean, he's been through things I hope I never have to go through. So I have a deepest respect for that. But the board have, and the chairman may want to say something about this, have come to a decision, that includes myself, by the way, to balance two fairnesses. To balance the fairness to people over 75, like Mr. Edwards, how we work through and hold a concession which is fair to them, whilst also being fair to the majority of licence fee payers who don't want and would have to fund the 750 million if the concession was to carry on. And those two fairnesses have been the things we're trying to balance, and it seemed to the board, but the chairman will want to say more about that, that the right way forward was to attach therefore the concession to pension credit. Not our determination of poverty among pensioners, but the government. It's not up for us to determine what poverty the level is, but for the government.
Well, this is your decision. It has become your decision, and we agree that that shouldn't be the case, but it is a fact.
But it does, yeah.
And it's within, and I would plead with the board of the BBC Trust to look again at the position as far as veterans is concerned. You've chosen a means-tested approach, but I think that, I mean, we've all seen the context of the commemorations that we've been experiencing, which are a big part of you helping to sustain our national identity. And it just seems completely wrong to be taking away something that is hugely important to that generation in the way that you are. So can you please reconsider that?
Well,
and I'll ask the chair.
Let me comment on this because I also have great sympathy with your constituent, and we know the importance that the BBC plays in terms of those who are socially isolated, etc., as a companion, and that has weighed with us very heavily. As Lord Hall said, we sought to reach a decision which was fair to those over the 75 who are the most financially disadvantaged, but fair to all our audiences. There would be a price to be paid if we were to extend it to everybody. I think to your constituent I would say a number of things. First of all, if he is financially disadvantaged, he needs to look carefully at his position. One of the reasons that the Age UK was concerned about means testing through the pension credit is the level of pension credit take-up is well below those eligible. About 60% of those eligible take it up. We have undertaken, with Age UK, Independent Age, and a number of similar groups, we'd be happy to probably talk Clare to some of the veterans group, to help them understand how the pension credit system works and ensure whether they're eligible. Because if they are below that level, they will get a free television license. The second point to say is, and a number of people come back to me and say, well, the pension credit isn't sufficient. I think that we have to recognise, I think everybody recognises, that the issue about the level at which pension poverty, which is still an issue, should be alleviated, is finally a matter for government. Its chosen instrument is the pension credit, and therefore the level of pension credit is a matter correctly for government, not for us. The next thing I want to say is that you asked whether the BBC is going to think again. We have been through the most massive, almost unprecedented consultation, setting out precisely what the criteria are by which we'd reach a decision, setting out what the options are. We've had 180,000 responses. That's the quantitative part. We've also had a mass, which we've shared with you already, of qualitative responses. Among the qualitative responses are those who think the concession should remain and those who think there is a problem. Those who represent, if you like, the creative industries or those involved in employment, the TUC, the CBI, our own unions, the NUJ, BECTU, expressed considerable concern about our extending the concession to all parties over 75. On the other side, those who thought the concession should continue, and I think particularly, excuse me, of Age UK, who were concerned about it and have said it considered, are very clear that the person who should reconsider, or the body who should reconsider, is that of government. You referred to the manifesto committee. That's a matter for you and a matter for the government. But nevertheless, if you look at the Age UK petition, and it's now been signed by 600,000 people, and it may well include your constituent, their question is addressed not to us, but to the government.
But this is now your decision. This is a decision of the Trust Board, and you've made
Well,
it.
it's not the Trust Board, as you've pointed out, not as you will know, a perfect government structure, and one that I recommended should be got rid of.
And we agree with you on that.
And you did agree with me on that point, and you've provided further evidence in connection with them. But it is now a decision, and we have followed the Digital Economy Act, passed by this Parliament, to the letter. So the suggestion from Mr. Knight that we're not good for our word is very unfair. We have followed the Digital Economy Act, agreed by this Parliament, agreed in the 2015 settlement. We have followed it to the letter.
Okay, so this package that you're now presenting is the BBC's package, and you have the power to change it. There are 2 Normandy veterans in Wrexham, and they will not be eligible to retain a TV
Because
licence.
they're above pension credit limit.
Yeah. So I think what you should do is give a concession to Normandy veterans at least. We're talking about a small amount of money. I don't think that there will be anyone who speaks out against that. And I would ask you today...
Well, I know your view. Of course,
Please,
Claire, you may
can
want
I
to...
just finish?
There are vast of people
Can I
dementia people
Yeah.
who want us to consider. But the issue rests now with the government as to whether they want to meet what
No,
they
it doesn't.
said.
It rests with you.
Oh, sorry,
It doesn't.
just to follow up on an important point here. So there will be some people who will qualify for pension credit.
Yes.
Some people will be claiming already,
Yes.
but as we've said, actually, part of the greatest problem with pension credit take-up, as Age UK and others have said, is around visibility of pension credit. And over the last few weeks, I would suggest the visibility of pension credit has definitely gone up. We've been working with others, for example, Independent Age, who are running their own campaign about pension credit take-up. Now, that could potentially affect over 600,000 people who could then potentially get £2,500 each, which is a significant amount of money, plus the top-up benefits that they would then get. But the other thing that perhaps may assist your constituents, although I recognise not entirely, and I also would pay tribute to their service, is that actually one of the things we asked ourselves was it reasonable to ask this group of people to pay a full TV licence in one go? And so therefore what we have done is we've introduced a small instalment scheme which will be around £3 a week for all the television that we know is so valuable to them. And this is a group that consumes over 30 hours of BBC, TV or radio content. It doesn't fully address your question, but the issue I think was that in terms of all the options we consulted on all the variants that we looked at, in the end we thought that pension credit was the fairest thing to do. And actually when you look at what Age UK said only in January, pension credit is the single most important poverty alleviation mechanism for older people that we have in this country. So we have to recognise that. That includes for veterans. And of course, if the government wanted to do more for veterans as well, they could of course do so.
Yeah. There are a lot of pensioners who don't receive pension credit, who actually who have applied for pension credit but don't qualify, who don't consider themselves at all well off. So there's a lot of people who are concerned about this proposal. And the reason why the government passed it to you bluntly is because it's a hand grenade politically, and you've been given it. I'm just appealing to you again in this particular case. It's not about one person; it's about a group of people. I think, particularly in view of your public service role, which I respect. Please think again and reflect following today. I'm not going to ask you, put you on the spot again. I understand the position concerning the pension credit. We should be using this as a way of extending take-up of pension credit. That's not your responsibility. One of the problems with this policy is that it's mixing government and the BBC in a way that isn't appropriate. But I think on this particular specific point, I'd be grateful if you would think again.
Well, I'll take it away. I would like to make it clear. There are a number, and you've mentioned one, which we all recognise, and indeed the BBC was there to recognise that day in size. There are a number of groups for whom this is quite a difficult issue, but I'm concerned about the BBC being drawn too much into social policy. And I think that rightly this is a matter for the government. The question of the level of pension credit, actually you've told me your constituents above that level, nevertheless they wouldn't think they were well off. Nevertheless, the level at which it is set is finally a matter for government and not for us. We will take it away, but I can give no certainty as to what my board will think.
Okay. What you could also do is speak to the government about that, because I heard the Secretary of State speaking on this issue last Thursday at questions, and I think there may be an opening if we work together on the government.
A couple of quick questions from Philip Davis and then Simon Hart.
Thank you, Chairman. Just quickly, as a new boy, just to get my head around the figures. I was reading the BBC News website, so I'm sure it must be true, which said that the new scheme will cost the BBC, what you're proposing on pension credit, will cost the BBC around £250 million a year by 21-22. Is that right? So presumably it's less than that to start with, but it'll be more up to that figure by then.
There's some also, but in the first year there's some very considerable administrative costs in making it.
But it's 250, so that's right. What it said on the BBC website is right.
And it depends on the take of the pension credit. Which
Yes,
is
but
it's
right. It's
yeah,
right.
It's
what we
right.
said.
Now, the Secretary of State said in DCMS questions last week, and perhaps you can confirm whether this is right, that in this financial year of actually giving the free TV licences for over 75s, the cost to the BBC this year was £453 million. Is that right?
No, so if I can respond to that, so the DWP has been stepping down the amount that they've given us in regard of over 75 licences. That started in 1819, it continues into 1920 and drops down completely. So from a 650 million starting point, that reduced down to 450 last year, reduces down again this year. So we are working through and managing some of that shortfall. And in this year we've had to deliver savings to deliver on that. But we've also been a year of deficit. So we've spent ahead of the income we've come in because of the 180 million shortfall in income we've had from DWP this year.
Yeah, if we could just stick to the question to be helpful, which is that the Secretary of State said last week in the chamber, and I'm sure he wasn't misleading the House, I would be astonished if he was, that this financial year the cost to the BBC of this policy for free TV licence for over 75s is £453 million. Is that? It's a simple question as to is that right, or is it? We don't need any waffle around it. Is that right or is that wrong?
That is not a number I recognise as the cost.
So what is the
of
cost of the BBC this financial year?
As I sort of said, in 1819 we had a reduction of
I'm asking you, what is the cost of the... I mean, it's a simple question. Why don't you just give a simple one? What is the cost to the BBC in this financial year of free TV licences for over 75s? It can't be a difficult question to answer.
We have had a reduction in what was
Yes,
funded
we know
by
all that.
DWP.
What is the cost?
The DWP funded free TV licence fee. That income was at 650 million. We had a reduction in 1819 of 180 million. So I guess,
we know
I guess
all
your
that.
answer, your equivalent cost is
180
million.
You're saying that so the cost of the BBC this year of this policy is 180 million?
That is the reduction in income that we've had from DWP, yeah.
No. What? I'm not asking what the reduction is this year. I'm asking the total cost. It's not a difficult question. What is the total? Let me try and help you out. I find it a story. I think what I suspect you either don't know the answer or you don't want to tell me the answer. I thought this was going to be a simple question, Mr. Chairman. I do apologise. The Secretary of State said that last year the BBC paid £209 million towards this cost, and in this financial year the BBC will pay £453 million. That's what the Secretary of State said in DCMS. They've got the Hansard here. This is what the Secretary of State said in DCMS questions last week. So, are you saying that the Secretary of State was misleading the House when he said that?
I'm explaining to you what is happening in terms of the cost. So the DWP provides the cost of licence fees at the moment for over 75s. That steps down the period. The BBC inherits it from 2020. That's the policy. But there's a step down. There's a reduction in income.
The government's accepted there's a step down, and he's saying that this year the total cost of the BBC is £453 million.
There's a very complicated transitional arrangement over a number of years that was baked into the original deal, and I think we should write to you to set out what the transitional arrangement is. But the issue for the board is not actually what the arrangements are. The issue for the board is moving forward. From 2020, we take on...
Sorry, Sir David, I think Philip is perfectly in his right to try and get clarity on the figures. If I may, I think the issue here might be that Mr. Isherwood, you were referring to the figure in the accounts, the 180 million. I think the Secretary of State was referring to probably what is the 1920 figure rather than the 1819 figure.
It's a rundown figure. Where we carry more
this financial year, the clue was in the question. This financial year. Now, the point I'm making, it's all right, you, Sir David, saying what the issue is. We'll decide what the issues are for you tomorrow. You won't decide what the issues are.
I have to worry a lot about
the issue is that this year you're paying £453 million for this, and you're now saying that you can only afford and presumably you believe that the BBC output is wonderful, as you usually do. So, but next year you're saying that you get from the future years you can only afford to pay £250 million. So basically, you are using this policy, in effect, to transfer the blame onto the government for it, when you're actually pocketing, in effect, you're going from costing you £453 million this year to costing you £250 million a year in future years. You're pocketing £200 million here, hoping that over 75 pensioners won't notice, and blaming the government on it. That's basically the facts of the matter, isn't it?
We're not pocketing any money, I don't think, are we? I mean, the amount of money that the government is giving us is scaling down from whatever it was, 750, down to zero.
Yes.
It's a complicated
We're
transition.
running at a deficit because actually that's what it is. We've saved money early on to pay for the deficit as it comes down to zero later on. That's the issue that we're doing. It's a balance.
So we've drawn down that cash reserve to fund that.
You're going to be £200 million a year better off on this concession next year than this year.
We are currently using some of the cash reserves built up at the early start of the charter period. We're drawing down those. In each year, we are running at a deficit. We did that in 1819. We did that in 1920. We need to reverse that and get increments. So to sustain ourselves and build up our cash.
But you accept that the cost for you, the BBC, in future years, for this policy will be £200 million lower than in this financial year.
No, the cost for us at the end of the 5-year period is 750 million. What we've been doing, and it's really very straightforward, what we've been doing is money which has come from the government is being withdrawn. We have put in money, cash we've saved up front from the beginning of the period. We're now running that down. Maybe that's where the confusion lies. We're actually running ahead of our means at the moment because we're saved for the moment when we knew the cash would be coming out from the government's point of view. I mean, it's quite a simple equation.
Perhaps if we could take up the chairman's offer that if the BBC could write to us and just confirm what the transition payments are.
Yeah.
Maybe in the same letter as well, because this figure of 750 million is quoted. But I think, to be fair, from that 750 million should be deducted the value of the benefits that were accrued in the negotiation on the consumer prices index, inflationary increase in the licence fee, the iPlayer loophole and the top slicing, because they were part of the agreement. So I think it'd be fair to consider the net figure, which is the value of that removed from the 750 million. So,
thank you. By way of a short pause, can we go back to the consultation outcomes? And I was interested in hearing Ian Lucas's comments about his particular constituent, but it struck me that there must be groups of very deserving people who've provided long and often risky service to the country for many years, all of whom might be able to make a similarly compelling case about their own circumstances. And so I was wondering what the consultation findings actually revealed in that respect. And if they're published somewhere and I haven't read them, I apologise, but it may be useful for this particular hearing to know what they say and what sort of proportion of the respondents took a particular view on that. A number of, perhaps you could touch on if the veterans' charities made submissions, if indeed MPs made submissions on behalf of their constituents, and if so, whether they could be summarised without compromising any sort of anonymity elements. So how did that come across, and how did it influence your decision making?
So we ran a very large consultation which involved 4 components. All of the reports have been published at the same time as our decision. And I think specifically we had a very large public consultation with over 85,000 people. We had a BBC stakeholder consultation where we contacted over 1,000 organisations and every member of this House to participate. And we published the list and included their responses to it.
Did that include veterans charities out of interest?
I think that in terms of the overall responses, very few people mentioned veterans, and I'm not sure any veterans charities did respond to us directly. However, one of the things I have done is written to a number of organisations around how to work together to do 2 things. One is best practice to support this group of elderly people, and the other is to raise the visibility of pension credit. And I am going to reach out to appropriate veterans organisations to discuss some of these issues further with them. I think what did come through in our consultation is we published, both at the time of the consultation, so last November, and also with our decision, an equality impact assessment. And a number of people commented on that. which leads you to look at, for example, issues of gender. So, for example, there are more women, as you know, who are over 75 than men because of life expectancy. There are more disabled people in this group, and those with long-term illnesses, and also potentially those who are on the poverty line and could be most affected. Having looked at all of that, and having looked at the way that pension credit works, the way that disability benefits work, and the way that, in effect, what was the fairest decision to take, we took all of that into account before the board then made its final decision. And I think, as the Chair was referring to earlier, particularly in the stakeholder responses, there was a lot of concern to ensure, in effect, what was the fairest thing to do for this group of people. Many older groups felt that it was going to be fairest to continue the concession, but many raised the fact that they thought government should pay for it. Others felt very strongly, if you like, more from the media creative industry, that they had a real concern about what would that investment potential cut be in the creative economy and creative sector, which I know this committee has looked at before. You know, how do PSBs support the whole of the industry? I think we also saw, and I've spoken to recently, people from Dementia UK around how do we make sure as we implement this policy, we make it as accessible and appropriate as possible. And one of the things that you have to do with this cohort, and actually it's not just necessarily this cohort, but it's to make sure that carers and family representatives are also aware of these policies, how they are changing so that they can be supported. We've actually also written to over 4 million households who will be affected by this change, explaining that there's nothing anybody needs to do now, but that there actually will be more things that we will be reaching out for them to explain what we're doing, including outreach events, but also making sure that we're linked into all of the relevant organisations, which, coming back to the top of your question, would include veterans organisations.
Just from public reaction, I mean, and it's a crude measurement, I know, but were you able to detect the very simple distinction between support and opposition for this proposal?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in our main public consultation of around 85,000 people, it was, and this debate has shown actually, it was finely balanced. But 48% ended up saying that their preferred option was to just copy the concession.
Not another 48,
and,
52
yeah, and
split,
52%, I'm sorry to say, supported some form of change. The least support across all of the age groups was to abolish the concession, and we thought that that was right, not to abolish the concession, because that wouldn't have been the fairest thing to do. The other two key things that came out time and time again from this consultation was the importance of pensioner poverty and making sure that in its decision the BBC should address that, and also, and I think Mr. Lucas referred to this, the importance of companionship that this group get from the BBC and television in general. Now, we respected both of those things, and that's what led us to do a very targeted approach with the financial impact on the BBC of saying that we should help the poorest older pensioners, and the best way to do that is through pension credit, although, as we've discussed, there needs to be some improvements there.
My last question on this. I know that the figure of 75 years of age was a figure that has been imposed on you as opposed to an age which has a conclusion that you've reached yourselves. On the basis that pension income is a fixed income model, what sort of discussion did you have around the arbitrary nature, if you could describe it, that of 75? Why not 70, 77 or 73?
So as you all know, I mean, under the Digital Economy Act, the BBC were given the power to look at age-related concessions from 65 and above.
Right.
And so part of our discussion, part of our consultation very openly, was actually, you know, what was the right age threshold? And that could have ranged from 65 onwards. We did consult on a specific age issue, was actually, should we raise the age threshold to 80? But much of the feedback that came back was that actually, as the chairman was saying earlier, for 75-year-olds, it's at that point potentially that it's very hard to change your financial circumstances. Some of the work that Frontier, intergenerational various organisations have done show that actually in terms of wealth, the kind of 65 to 74-year-olds are in some ways better off than the 75 cohort. So again, it was a difficult decision, but we thought where the boundary was probably in the right place. And as you know, once you become 80, additional benefits such as state pension, perhaps more winter fuel discount, you are then, you can then qualify for. But I think in the end, we felt the fairest decision was to help those who are the poorest at 75.
Thank you.
Just a quick question before we move on. Glyn, Isherwood, you said earlier on that the cost last year, financial year, to the BBC for the over-75s licence fee was 180 million. That was correct, wasn't it? So we also said that the BBC had to borrow money because of those additional costs. But from other figures in the report, the report says that the BBC made 153 million in efficiency savings last year, and that the cash revenue increase, not just the total, but the increase in the year from BBC Studios was 59 million. So just taking those two components together gives you 212 million. So it is possible, if resources have been allocated differently, that 180 million could have been met from increased commercial revenue and efficiency savings rather than borrowing.
So in 18-19, we did have a step down in the income, which I've already explained. We did have an efficiency programme, as you highlight, and we're at the sort of second tier of that programme now. So we did 153 million out of an 800 million target, cumulatively 397 to date. So we're making progress on that, but it gets harder as we carry on.
I understand that, but there wasn't a question I asked. It's just to say, it might be very simple. I'm not an accountant, but just to say that the impression you gave us was the BBC had no option other than to borrow more, go into deficit this year because of this 180 million it's taken on. Yeah. But actually, if resources had been allocated differently, that 180 million could have been found through the savings and the increase and the growth in commercial revenue.
Well, given that we delivered 153 million savings, which we've put towards that concession already in the year, finding savings over and above that would have been very difficult, and a commercial performance over and above that which was delivered would also have been incredible. We've had a very good performance in year, but in that year it's not sustainable because we've had to draw down on some of our cash, not going to borrowing, we haven't drawn on borrowing yet, but to draw down our cash reserves to fund our operations, even with 153 million of savings in the year, and even with a very strong commercial performance. The position is not sustainable because we're carrying the cost of transition in the over-75s. That picture and deficit gets bigger in 1920, and by 2021 it stabilises because we have income coming in from collecting money from the over-75s.
Yeah. The point I was trying to make was that the cash drawdown that you've done in the accounts for this year we're discussing, it can't just be about the 180 million because there would appear to be enough additional revenue and efficiency savings built in already. You may be drawing down cash for other reasons. You might have liked 180 million to spend on other things, but I quite appreciate that. But yeah, the books would suggest that there was enough cash in the system just to meet that obligation on its own if that was the only extra outlay you had to think about.
Well, I mean, there are many factors that sort of have an impact on our income and costs in year. So in year we would have had other revenue coming in from the commercial operations. We had a income that comes in from licence fee, and that could depend on household growth and TV penetration. And at the same time we have varying rights of content costs. So last year we had the World Cup, we had the Commonwealth Games, which needed funding and needed delivering to audience expectations. We did a good job all around that.
Yeah, okay. Brendan O'Hara.
How much will it cost to set up a new system to collect a licence fee from those over 75s?
So in our decision document, we set out two forms of cost. So the first, if you like, transition year will cost around £38 million.
38? Is that to set up the systems?
That's to set up the systems. That is partly because there's a lot of communication that we need to do. There's also setting up a new payment plan, as I referred to earlier. And there's just the kind of, if you like, the data systems and everything we need to put in place properly. Then the running cost of that will be around 13 million. I mean, these are estimates, Chair, but just in those broad ballpark terms. And those figures, not the 38 million, which will come out of the BBC budget, but the 13 million are part of what Mr Davis was referring to earlier in terms of that ongoing 250 million cost. So that broadly explains where that money will go.
Okay, so 38
yeah,
and a one-off payment to set up the system,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
then 13 million per annum
so running costs.
To run it.
And obviously potentially that 13 million could go down, but you know, we need to make sure that we allow some scope there for implementation, which is why we said the 250 million is slightly subject to the implementation costs and the take-up of pension credit.
Okay, and the 250 million will be based on everybody paying. That's not based. Have you worked in an evasion or a non-payment rate into that?
We have added in an evasion rate into that because as we
percentage?
do. So I think that comes from the frontier work that we established earlier, which was around 8%. Now that is higher than the average evasion rate, which is at 6.57%, I think, or around 6.5%. And obviously, part of that is because we're expecting a transition here. Now, one of the reasons we took our decision, if you like, a year before June 2020 is enable us to make those preparations, but also, as we've said earlier, work with organisations and work with people to help make that transition as simple as possible.
Okay, so you worked on the basis of an 8% non-payment rate. Part of your armoury in getting people to pay is you quite vigorously pursue non-payers of the licence fees. Is it your intention to have the same people using the same methods to pursue over-75s as they do non-75s?
So what we've done is we think it's really important to do this as kind of sympathetically as possible. So we are doing several things which are kind of best practice. So we recognise that this group will need perhaps more kind of both telephone support but face-to-face support. So we're actually recruiting a specific group of people who will actually pay support visits to this group with the intention of helping them understand what the system is and how to apply. Now that will be a different cohort of people to I think what's called our inquiry officers, who are the ones who kind of enforce the licence fee. So we have decided very specifically, which is why there are costs involved in this, to employ a specific group of people and also add more people to, if you like, our telephone hotlines who will be specifically dealing with this cohort of people. We think that's really important.
Okay, so and that the cost of that cohort of people is included in the 13 million, yeah?
So in the 38 million, that's beginning to, for us to hire the additional contact centre staff, and then the ongoing costs of having those groups are in the 13 million.
Around the 13 million. So essentially, you'll be using the same tactics but with different faces coming to your door.
No, I don't think it is the same tactics, actually. I think what we are trying to do is work with this group so that we will do more to support this group, both through online contact, hotlines, and also face-to-face visits. And basically as well also work with those organisations which we know these groups are in contact with already. So, for example, Age UK, Independent Age, Dementia. So, and we're also introducing a new, smaller payment scheme for this group too. So we're doing a range of things that are different and take into account.
You know, if you are 75, 77, 80 years old and the licence fee person comes to your door, it's still, and you're a poor pensioner who simply can't afford to pay it, that's pretty traumatic, don't you think?
They won't be coming to your door in quite the way you imply. What TV licensing do is they first of all start by writing to people. We have written to, as I said, over 4 million households, setting out what they can expect. We will write again in February next year, which is when the TV licensing regulations will be approved by this House. And in that way, many people then comply, decide to set up a payment plan. However they want to pay at that point, they'll be able to. And for those who are on free TV licences, they can establish their eligibility by using proof of receipt of pension credit, and those people will qualify for a free licence.
But you do accept, though, that the people in that group are far more likely to be in the can't pay category rather than the won't pay category, and they have to be treated extremely differently from
I think
people in that
we have
group.
Absolutely recognised that in the plans that we're developing and putting in place. We've also taken into account, as I said earlier, that to pay the licence fee in one go may be difficult, so we are potentially setting up schemes where people can choose to pay as little as £3 a week. We're also making sure that we reach out to carers and family members, because we recognise that many in this group may not actually want to do the form themselves directly, but to make it as easy as possible. We'll also be doing outreach events, working with potentially local GP surgeries, local community centres, to try and really make this as simple as we possibly can.
Okay. Your estimate is, on the current take-up of pension credit, that the new concession will bring in £250 million, yeah? We've heard already 4 in 10 people who are eligible for pension credit don't currently take it up. So have you worked out what happens to that 250 million figure when those who are eligible for pension credit do take it up?
Yeah, I mean, there are a range of scenarios here, and the Chairman may wish to say more about this. Of course we have, and you'll see that independent age suggests to the government that they should actually reintroduce targets that I think were there when pension credit was first introduced, of around 75%, and building up, imagine, over time. So we've looked at different financial scenarios. And obviously, if it were to rise to as far as 100%, then that would cost us more than 250 million.
Well, this is what I'm going to say. At what point does it become... Now, is there a percentage figure that you have that becomes financially impossible for you to do?
Not financially impossible, but the balance between, for the Treasury, where actually the cost to them is more than the 500 million cost if they were to plug the gap, is round about 77 to 78%, if I recall, take-up.
A 78% take-up of pension credit would make this uneconomic for the Treasury. Yeah.
But it would be outweigh the benefits by putting the 500 or 750 million on us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the estimates we've got is 75%, bearing in mind we've got some other additional costs that we've been discussing, is around 248 million. And for government, potentially, depending on the numbers who claim, about 680 million. Now, those figures go up exponentially as pension credit, take-up could go up. I mean, one of the things we don't know, obviously, is kind of how much it will go up. But we can certainly see that the visibility of it has increased, and people are taking, including us, more queries about pension credit and how you should be able to apply.
Okay. What percentage of people pay their licence fee by direct debit?
I'm afraid I don't have those figures with me, but
we can get you.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's 25 million households.
Isn't it the case that you pay for your licence in the first 6 months if you pay by direct debit, and all subsequent payments made that year go towards the cost of the following year's licence? So the licence fee payer is always in credit by about £77 a year.
That's right. 76.3% of people pay by direct debit. Just to
Sorry,
answer.
what's that figure?
76.3% of around 25 million households are paying by direct debit. That's their chosen method. And what you suggest is right, that for the majority of those people, there is a prepayment that's made, so that in effect you're always in credit with us.
Right, okay. So,
but we wouldn't do that.
No, we're not doing that for the over 75s.
We wouldn't ask you to pay in advance in that sort of way.
Right, well, because it's interesting, because following the announcement of the scrapping of the free licence for over 75s, a constituent of mine, Ruth Campion from Helensburgh, inquired about this because she was expecting, when she reached her 75th birthday, to have her £77 repaid. She was told by the folk at the BBC licensing that if she didn't qualify for pension credit and therefore didn't qualify for a free television licence, then the money that she was owed would be refunded to her estate on her death. Is that right?
I haven't heard of that particular case. That doesn't sound quite
that's
right to me.
Can I just say that's just wrong?
Yeah.
So where would Ruth get her refund from then? Because when she reaches her 75th birthday, she assumed she was getting it refunded, and she was told, well, you don't qualify for a free television licence, so it will just roll on. And she said, well, when will I get it? And she was told it will be refunded to your estate.
Well, I'm very happy to take that up separately. We can't comment on that individual case, but that doesn't sound quite right to me, Chair.
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Chair. Lord Hall, so taking the questions an exchange with the Chair earlier on, you agree that the licence fee concessions are a welfare benefit and should be administered by the government?
I agree that the concession and the determination of who should. It's a welfare benefit administered by the government. Yes.
Okay. And so, did the government seek any guarantee from you in the 2015 deal that you would secure the concessions for all over 75s going forwards?
No.
So you made it clear to them that it wasn't sustainable and that it would require reform if the BBC was to take it on.
Yes.
So so taking it from your exchange earlier on, so in order to do what you consider to be a favourable deal for the BBC, you took on the dirty job of cutting concessions for over 75s.
I think there was no option, as those who were there at the time have made absolutely clear. This was coming to us, whether we wanted it or not. This was a new Conservative government with a majority coming in fresh with the success of that election. This was coming our way, come what may.
Right. So, but you made it clear that it was going to have to be cut at the time that you took it on. And the government were happy for you to do that, and they didn't seek any guarantee that you would protect it going forward.
That's right.
So you took on the responsibility for cutting it.
We did.
And you did that knowingly. So the BBC sold the 75-year-olds down the river in order to get a deal.
No, let me be absolutely clear. I go back to it. Did we sell people down the river? Absolutely not.
Well, you did, because you were clear about what you were doing.
I care deeply about what I do.
I know, this
policy was coming to us, come what may. The question was how many concessions could we win from that to offset it, and the other question was what the nature of the policy would be and how we would carry out a consultation to reform. So the difficulty was it is perfectly possible that the consultation, it being a fair and open consultation, could have said, 98%. Stick with the concession. The fact that it didn't means we're in the position we are today.
We all accept it was a consultation you shouldn't have been holding in the first place, but because it shouldn't have been your responsibility. But the fact is, and you've just repeated it, you did a deal, and the part of the deal was that you took on the responsibility for doing this to cutting this concession for over 75s. You took on that responsibility, knowing that you were going to have to cut it.
We knew that reform was on the table. We didn't know the scope of that reform or the scale of that reform back in 2015. But the policy, just to be clear, it was made absolutely clear by the government, the policy comes to you, and that's what the Digital Economy Act did.
It's just quite clear it is part of a deal, isn't it? It's part of a deal that you agreed with the government. Government didn't want to make this cut itself. It dumped it on you, and in return for this, you get these other benefits, and you took on that responsibility.
That was part of the settlement, yes.
And so it's just so that we're clear about it was a quid pro quo as part of a deal that you would have to take this service away.
It was a settlement that said
and it was known at the outset that you were going to do it. You knew it, and the government knew it.
We need to just because Mr. Knight has argued that the expectation was that we would continue the concession. You seem to be arguing that the expectation was that we would definitely cut. My view, having spoken to many people, but Tony, you need to speak about it, is that there was no absolute expectation. Reform was certainly in the air, John Whittingdale said so at the time, but there was no absolute certainty as to what the outcome would be, nor could there have been, since the thing was going to happen 5 years hence.
Well, I'm a little bit more confused now, because when I asked the original question to Lord Hall, he was quite clear that it would have to be cut, that there would have to be reform.
What we took on board was the concession over 75s would come to us. We would then consult depending on the consultation and the results of that consultation, which had to be a fair and proper consultation, we could reform. And as John Whittingdale made absolutely clear, they knew at the time that was a possibility. So the idea that somehow it's not a possibility, that was not a possibility, or somehow we have reneged on some settlement is just plain wrong.
Okay, but I think we're going around in circles now. The point is established.
I just wanted to, for the record, restate what it says in the BBC Trust minutes for that day, on the 6th of July, when the decision was made. The Director General and the Managing Director of Finance and Operations updated the Trust on their discussions with the government. The Executive's position was to accept the government's decision to transfer the cost of the over-75 licences to the BBC on the basis of the government's proposed mitigations and its support for the BBC's long-term financial stability. The Director General and the Executive would work to develop a strategic plan so the BBC was ready to live within the new financial parameters. I'm just reading what is in the minutes of the board meeting of the BBC Trust on that day. And so, Chairman, shake your head. I mean, that's what it says.
The minute is inadequate because it is absolutely clear.
So it's been adequate for 4 years.
Because come on, the plan which is outlined in that is exactly the plan we've been outlining now. The policy was coming to us. It was clear. I mean, the Secretary of State is quite clear about that. I don't understand, therefore, why you're not. The then Secretary of State is quite clear. I don't understand why you're not.
All I'm saying is that is what it says in the BBC Trust minutes, a meeting you were at that was held on the day the decision was announced. And I think, I'm not surprised you challenged the minutes, because when you read them, it doesn't really bear on what you said. I don't understand why you've not challenged the record.
Can I just say, I was there, and none of you were. The issue of the of what
Nor
would
was
be
the minute taken.
The issue of the over-75s and the reform of the over-75s and going through a consultation was absolutely part of that decision making. The trust knew that, as did we.
Okay, well, as I said, if I was the minute taker of that meeting, I obviously came out of that meeting with a slightly different view.
Sorry, can I say that nobody left that meeting without understanding that?
I do want to say, Chairman, I've seen the exchange of letters between the BBC and the Secretary of State. They make quite clear that the responsibility and the cost implication of that policy decision rested with the BBC.
But
I don't know what we can't speak for the minute.
The reason these minutes I think are important is because, as Lord Hall said earlier, ultimately it was down to the trust to degree to this. And if you were at that meeting of the trust, you might have had a totally different impression of what had been agreed to that is now being set out.
And I'm sure that would have been raised when the Parliament discussed the Digital Economy Act. We've followed the Digital Economy Act to the letter.
Sorry, Clive.
Okay, I mean, I think we've done that. I mean, established, I think, the facts of that. But so in terms of using pension credit as the gateway to the concession, and you've answered earlier on the reasons why you came to that, but and you've said, Ms. Sumner, that you intend to work with other organisations to promote awareness of pension credit. So can we expect the BBC to run a public awareness campaign on its channels to make sure people know how to claim pension credit? Or is there a disincentive for the BBC to do that because the more people that do claim pension credit, the more it will cost you?
We will do everything that we can to make sure, one, that this is carried out sensitively, as I think Mr. O'Hara was talking to Clare Sumner about, and we'll also use all our methods of informing the public what concessions could be and how you can apply for them and so on.
So something in the form of public service broadcasts.
We started doing that. We started doing that. Yes.
2, 3, 4, for example. Now, what we've got to do, of course, is we've got to explain both elements here. We've got to explain what's in place now, the new payment scheme for people who have to pay, and actually on pension credit, if you're eligible, and also link them to organisations that can help them.
Okay. Now, it is open to the government to step in and say we want to continue with the benefit. Have you had any discussions with the government about that? Have you made an approach? Is there any response?
We've had a meeting with the government. They made their unhappiness with the decision very clear. They also have began talking with us about how we can work together on ameliorating and making sure people understand, with DWP, how we can approach people, etc., etc. But there's not been anything about will you take back that the concession in full. That's a matter for the government and for a new government, I guess.
But that option's there for them, and they've not made any approach to you to say we want to continue with this.
No.
So the deal that was struck in 2015 is still in place.
Yes.
Okay, and so when you came to the decision, when you were balancing your responsibility to that you took on in 2015 to people over the age of 75 against the costs and the implications for the BBC, what sort of things did you list as the cons for keeping the benefit in place? How did you balance your decision?
Well, financially, we looked at the costs of continuing the concession against how we would take out 750 million from our programme budget.
So what would have been lost in those programme budgets?
So in those programme budgets, we would have lost things of the order of, because let me just explain one thing to you. Between 2010 and about 2017, we did a huge amount of savings, which were good productivity savings, closing buildings, procuring in different ways, all sorts of big contracts in different ways, all sorts of things which were real efficiencies. And that's why our headline rate now of overhead is 5% versus 95% on programmes and services. So the position we're now in is we will carry on driving efficiencies, but at a lower level than we have done between 2010 and 2017, 2018. So you get very quickly to services, you get very quickly to cuts in scope. And we've outlined in our public declarations about this policy the balance we were looking at. So it would mean things like BBC4, BBC2, cutting back on our investment in the nations and regions and on local radio. None of which, and I think this came out strongly from the consultation, because I think both Clare and the Chairman have been through the balance of arguments that came out of the consultation. But there were very, very few places in the consultation where people said, we don't want the full array of services you're currently giving us. So, you know, that meant that to take out those, that amount of services to the public was both going against the spirit of what we had from the consultation, and of course would lead those people who are actually paying the full licence fee to say, but hold on, I'm now getting less value for money because I'm losing services for which I have hitherto paid.
Okay. And on the payment by instalments that you've offered to people over 75, is that the BBC setting up the first steps towards a subscription method of payment for?
No, I think that's a really interesting and good question. I mean, I think what we're looking to do is to make it as easy as possible for, to be honest with you, all licence fee payers to pay, and we want to make that as easy and as sensitive as possible. But look, is that the first step to saying, let's take a subscription model for the BBC? You could decide the BBC's subscription service. It would be very, very different to the sort of BBC you have now, because you would be giving the subscribers what they want, not the breadth of the population as giving them what they want, which is what the current system does. I think the licence fee is a secure way of paying for the BBC because it guarantees universality. It guarantees everybody access to news, to big sporting occasions, to dramas that bring people together, to local radio, to the national services we've got. And I think if you decide to say, is this the first step to subscription? Well, you might decide that's right for the BBC, but you have a very different BBC and you wouldn't have a universal BBC.
So the BBC hasn't looked at that as this is as a first step towards that. It's not examining what the benefits of a subscription process.
No, because I think one is the licence fee is a method of funding the BBC, a concession that I won in the charter renewal process until 2027. But even if it were, I would argue that's the wrong model for supporting the BBC, because I actually believe profoundly in things which are universal and which everybody benefits from. And in days when actually people are disappearing into their own zones much more and more, those things that bring us together are really important. But can we learn from subscription models of making it very easy to pay? We should absolutely do that. You know, would we like to have a weekly method of payment for the BBC? Personally, I would. Whether we can deliver that, I don't know yet. But I think learning how to make it as easy as possible to pay, I think is what we can learn from the SVODs, the subscriber video on demand services.
Okay.
Thank you. Lee Rowley.
Chair, I want to move on to another issue that the BBC has at the moment, personal service companies, which we've spoken about, Lord Hall, before at Public Accounts Committee. So let's start with the qualification of your accounts. Do you think you should have got yourself into a place where your accounts were qualified almost at the same time as the NAO started taking on looking at your accounts?
Well, it's not a qualification to the accounts, it's the issue of irregularity. And let me just go back to make sure we're on the same page of this.
I just prefer you answer me the question, if that's possible.
Well, I've just answered the question, which is it's not a qualification of the accounts, it is a question of regularity. And I know you like binary questions too. I remember that very well. But this is a question which is we think it is right. Let me try to be fine about it. We think it's right to try to ameliorate the position that we have found ourselves in with PSCs, where we've said in many cases historically people were told by the BBC to take on PSC status historically. We want to get a deal with HMRC to be able to bundle these cases up and deal with it centrally. We're as you know, Mr. Rowley, we're finding this really hard to get traction with HMRC. We have prudently set aside a sum of money, which we think is prudent, for those cases. Because of this issue of regularity, the NAO have said we think this is not regular, i.e. it is not your core purpose. However, the issue of should we set this aside has been dealt with by the board and the board, as the legitimate authority running the BBC, thinks we were right to do that.
Excellent. And you've got a qualification from the National Audit Office, Controller General.
It's. Do you want to answer the qualification point? Because it's not a.
To sort of reiterate what I said, we have a.
No, I don't want to reiterate it. The question I'm asking is whether you're happy with the qualification of the National Audit Office. The second year that the NAO started looking at your account. So let's stick to the question.
It's a qualification in relation to regularity.
It's a qualification, quote unquote. I've qualified my audit opinion.
It's a qualification.
That is Amy Morse's statement. We're not going to argue with that. That's what he said. So we know what the qualification is. Are you happy with it? Yes or no? Binary question, as Lord Hall says. Love binary answers. Yes or no.
So, let me answer. I'm not happy with that because actually, and here I look to the board. The board feel we are doing the right thing. We want to solve the issue of PSCs and our presenters. Who find themselves, because of the change in the HMRC rules and the CES test and all of that, find themselves in a difficult position. And we set aside money for that. And so we think as a board we're right, and we are disappointed that the NEA should take this issue, if that answers the question.
And it does, thank you. So I just want to understand how you've got to where you've got to. So I'm looking at your statement from March 2018, where you set out in public that you need a compelling justification, which is your words, for assuming the tax liability is of others. What is that compelling justification?
Yeah, do you want to take it?
So there clearly is a dispute around what tax is owed due to the status classification of presenters over a period of time, looking back in history. That dispute exists between presenters, ourselves and HMRC. We accept that we have a role to play in resolving those issues. We're trying to do that in a way that is pragmatic, fair to presenters, but also fair to licence fee payers in a way that presents value for money. So while we have a qualification in the accounts in relation to regularity, we are doing it in a most pragmatic way, which ultimately delivers value for money for licence fee payers.
There's a difference between pragmatism and compulsion. So what is the compelling justification for this action?
Well, because we want to do right by the presenters who are suffering from the changes in HMRC rules, some or many of whom say they were compelled by the BBC historically back in the noughties to set themselves up as PSCs.
Okay, so you accept you did wrong with them? If you
yes, I've said it, actually, I can't remember which committee I've said it before, but I think we've accepted responsibility for that, yeah.
So to where you have sole traders who previously been classified as freelance, where they classified as employed, there's an employee's national insurance that needs to be paid, and where that's determined, we have to pay that, and we have a legal responsibility for that. Where we've engaged people through PSCs, the logic would follow that we have to make some payment to resolve the kind of issues in a similar fashion.
I'm just curious why that conclusion has been come to now rather than at the time this is, or close to the time, because this has been going on for a number of years.
Yeah. At the time, we didn't have sufficient engagement with our presenters around some of these issues. We've learned a lot over the last year, and we're now in a position where we want to resolve those. We haven't had any of those tribunals triggered, so we could take an alternative course of action, which is allow all our presenters to go through tribunal at significant cost, then come back and try and claim money off the BBC at significant cost and professional fees, and then we could settle and trigger a payment which would be regular under the definition of NAO's report. But we think the best course to go, which we agreed with the board, was this process.
So you've estimated this will cost 12 million in your accounts.
So we've made
so that is an estimate, correct? And how accurate is that estimate?
Well, what's difficult, because these are complex issues, is the categorisations are changing because as people presenters go through tribunals, we get different verdicts. So we've had to make the best assumptions we can based on what we understand now and based on our conversations so far and discussions with HMRC. But we've made 3 submissions already, and we can only work at the pace of the slowest there. You know, we move very quickly on these. The HMRC have much more deeper levels of governance and
so what is your confidence level?
Our confidence in relation to this, it will depend on how our discussions continue. We have a good level of confidence that that was the right provision to put in place at that time. But if cases go through tribunals that give different outcomes, then we would have to adjust that provision accordingly.
Well, you know, if I get run over tomorrow when I walk down the road, I'll be dead. So, you know, there's a series of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So I'm asking you to tell me how confident you have
as
in
we
your
made the provision,
modelling.
as we made the provision in our accounts, we had a high degree of confidence that we made the right provision.
Okay, fine. So it could be more than 12 million?
It could be, depending on the case of tribunals.
What's your range?
I mean, it will entirely depend on factors. When we discussed with the National Audit Office what an acceptable material range around the edges would be, we thought of plus or minus 20%. But that's a range, and that could change depending on other factors.
Okay, so the extreme is 12 million plus 20%, so just short of 15 million. So it won't go above 15 million.
Based on what we know today, we don't expect to go above that limit.
Okay. Above 12 or above 15?
It will entirely depend. So
it won't entirely depend, because you have an evidence base which you've gathered over a number of years, which will enable you, as the people who have paid a lot of money to work this out, to give me a number which I'm asking you to give me.
Evidence, made a decision at the time to put a 12 million in. We understand that there's kind of flex beyond that, and that we don't think that would be more than 20%.
Okay. What's the average settlement you're expecting?
The average.
Sorry, the average settlement per individual that you expect to pay?
Well, so we have more than 300 PSCs running through these issues at the moment. So if you divided the 12 million by 300, so I think you get to about £40,000. But that's over a period of 4 years for tax and 6 years for NIC.
And have you settled any to date, or have you come to as close to a settlement with any to date as you can?
So we've, as you know, we've communicated to our presenters to say what the underpinning principles are in a settlement. We've only settled those that have absolutely gone through tribunal and lost, and we've made a payment in 1 or 2 cases, but not many. But
Okay,
we haven't substantially drawn down.
And what's the average settlement of the ones you've actually settled?
I don't have that information.
Is it far away from 40,000?
I don't have that information.
Can you write to either the chair or to my committee?
Perhaps you could write to this committee, and we'll make sure that the Public Accounts Committee receives that as well.
That'd be great. Thank you. I'm also curious, and perhaps I'm reading too much into your public statements. In your 19th of March 2018 public statement, you talk about assuming some responsibility and assessing whether it's appropriate to make any contribution. Whereas by the time you get to your 25th of March 2019 statement, you are talking in a much more broader sense of sorting the tax liabilities of individuals. Is it fair of me to make that assessment? You have moved your position in the last year or so. You are taking on the full liability.
I think we are, and I think having spent more time with presenters and come to this issue afresh, we are accepting that we played a role in presenters setting up PSCs, and we've got a role to play in closing this issue down.
Okay. So the 12 million or the 15 million or whatever it ends up being at the end of this, according to your account, page 229, it includes a number of things. The taxation itself, I'm clear on what the taxation is. It's what we're talking about, the average 40,000 or whatever it is. Litigation, is that cost of the litigation that the individual presenters may have gone through? You're indemnifying them for their costs on that?
No, we're not indemnifying costs for litigation. In the note that's set out in the accounts as provision, it includes other elements. So in the 12 million, it's purely the cost of settling this issue. It doesn't include litigation costs.
Okay, so 12 million is taxation.
There are other provisions in the accounts which include litigation costs.
How much is litigation costs so far? How much are you expecting?
So we haven't incurred any litigation costs in relation to taking PSCs through the courts. They, to the extent they want to do that, they fund that themselves.
Okay, and then you will pay them back, or they have to fund the costs of something which you've caused?
So we've worked with those people going through litigation and tribunals in terms of giving evidence to HMRC, supporting and making them understand some of the issues, but we haven't supported them in terms of legal costs.
Okay, but you accepted 5-10 minutes ago the responsibility for this, which means that you are the cause of them going through that legal process. Why are you not assuming the cost of that legal process?
Well, we're trying to find a way to avoid them having to go through this legal process.
Some of them have.
If an individual wanted to go through a legal process to get clarity going forward, that's one thing. But to clear up the historical issues, if they want us to help them do that in a way where we're all agreed that they were, should have been employed for tax status over that sort of period of time, then we're happy to settle. But what we're not doing is saying that every individual who runs a PSC, if they want to go to tribunal and fight their case, that we will support that.
And for those that have already those who have already incurred legal costs, are you paying those?
No, we haven't paid those.
Okay, even though you were the cause of those legal costs.
Well, these issues have been running for years with HMRC, and as you know,
but there's a point here, right? There was a very clear statement a number of minutes ago. You're responsible. You're responsible. Then you're responsible for it all. Not half of it, not 2/3 of it, not the bit you want. You're responsible for a lot of it, right? So if I'm sat here as a BBC radio presenter somewhere in the north of England and I've had to incur costs as a result of decisions that were made higher up, you're responsible for it.
I don't. It's not as binary as you suggest.
Has to be as binary as that.
Well, it's only as binary if people go through the courts and get the determination that satisfies all parties. At the moment, we're trying to find a way through this that avoids people having to incur significant costs and going through tribunals. We think that's the right thing for us to do.
Okay. So I'm not at all convinced that's the case, but let's move on. Insurance. What's that referred to in page 229 of your report?
Insurance in relation to the provision note.
Yeah, it says taxation, litigation and insurance.
So this is provisions for other types of core insurance. So the total, just to explain, the total provision note includes other things outside relation to employment issues.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So it may be related to something else.
Yeah.
Are you paying individuals affected by this anything else? Compensation, loss of time, any other aspects?
So the only other things that we've offered support around, we had a long list of requests a year ago from a number of our presenters, and we've done some things to help on that. So we've cleared up our admin processes and helped with that. We've provided some accountancy costs to help them understand statements they receive from the BBC. So we made a number of payments, and they were a maximum of £500 per individual.
Okay.
Total £30,000. But beyond that, we haven't incurred other costs in relation to.
And you have any intention of incurring any additional costs?
No, I mean, I think the only area that we've talked to some of the presenters around is if we get to a settlement with HMRC, which is a three-way settlement, which requires them to understand the issues, whether there's another tranche of fees similar to the accounting costs that helps them understand the settlement.
Okay. And have you internally modelled how much this has cost you to get here? Internal lawyers' fees, senior executive time taken up, etc., etc.
We haven't, as you know, these issues have been going on for many years. We haven't modelled in detail all the costs, but clearly we have been incurring costs in terms of our own time, which we haven't modelled, and some professional support from Deloitte, who's been helping us. But some of that goes back to some of the interpretation and understanding of the CES test, which came in 2017.
But I mean, we're in the context here of talking about a wider issue with regards to the money, the way you choose to spend your money. And we're talking here today about 12 to 15 million, plus additional on costs, whatever they are, probably in the millions, my estimate, not yours. We were at Public Accounts a number of months ago, and your EastEnders renewal is 30 million over. It doesn't look good, does it, when you're losing 30 million down the back of the sofa because you can't rebuild the Queen Vic, and you're losing the best part of 20 million here, or whatever it is, on disagreements with your employees, and then you're taking over 75
I'm afraid of the fact that
licenses away.
What we're doing is we're offering something which is the best value for money way of resolving these issues in the quickest way, which reduces the stress for our presenters. That's absolutely our priority here. In terms of building E20, and we've been through that previously at the kind of committee, and you know that we had substantial
It was a general point rather than
around.
Finally,
two thoughts, Mr. Riley, if I may.
Yeah.
One is we are dealing here with cleaning up historical problems. The PSC's problem is a historical problem, and the E20 set is also a historical problem where it was meant to last a matter of years, and we're now dealing with something which is, not worthy of the importance of the programme. So we are clearing up some historical problems that the BBC has had.
Finally, the intended outcome, so I am clear, is that you will close down these historical problems, in your phrase, Lord Hall. So they are closed entirely. HMRC will not be reopening them. You will be seeking assurances from HMRC that once they're closed and you pay the money, whatever the money is, that's it. It's gone for both you and it's gone for the presenters themselves.
We are seeking to draw a line under those historical issues and put aside a provision with the intention to do that.
And for a local radio presenter sat in the north of England today affected by this, the statement is clear. You guys will fix this, you will pay for it, it will go away.
So it's not as simple as you... there are kind of different issues, but we will pay our part in this. It's going to be up to presenters and PSCs to accept their level of contribution towards this, indeed if they've got issues of how they've run their PSC in the past, but we want to fix it in relation to BBC income drawn over that period of time.
But for the relevance to the BBC income, you will fix it, it will be sorted.
That's what we're seeking to do.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the last time last you appeared in front of us, we just discussed this, and obviously our concern was not just the financial cost of the BBC, but also the sort of suffering that many BBC employees have endured through this. The National Audit Office report and the PAC reports looking at this, established that this was due to a BBC policy change in 2008, requiring freelancers to establish personal service companies. I know the PAC went to some lengths to try and establish how and where that policy decision was made. Apparently, there is no record of it. But from a governance point of view, is it not concerning that there appears to be no board minute or other note which actually establishes who the author of this policy was and why it was agreed?
I wasn't there, but I repeat what I said to you. I said to the PAC when I was there that yes, it's strange.
Yeah. Thank you, Jo Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get a clear understanding, having listened to all the discussion about the over-75s issue, Lord Hall. You started off this morning by talking about trust and transparency, and I absolutely agree with you that for the future, that needs to be at the forefront of those discussions. So the BBC has kept its side of the charter deal, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. The government hasn't kept its side of the deal on the iPlayer issue.
It didn't carry out in full what it promised to do.
Right. And the government's 2017 manifesto, as Mr Lucas said, promised to keep pensioner benefits when the government knew they'd already given you that terrible hospital pass. That had been and gone.
They'd given us the over-75s concession and by law told us to sort it out by June of next year.
Yeah. And you raised this with them when the manifesto came out, and you haven't had any adequate response.
Yes.
Right, I'm clear on that now, thank you. I want to turn to something else, which is pay issues.
Yeah.
So, obviously you'll remember the previous hearings where we were looking into the issue of unequal pay or equal pay at the BBC. So I just wanted to ask you some questions about an update, really. So last September, Anne Bulford gave us evidence about the number of grievance cases, equal pay grievance cases that were in the system. And I think this was on September the 11th last year. And she said, at the moment we've got just over 200 cases that are in informal resolution stage. There are 78 formal grievances lodged, and at that point, 11th of September, there were 68 outstanding formal grievances to be resolved. So between last September and now, are you able to update us on the position on those cases?
Do you want to?
Perhaps if I do that. So you're right, we welcome people to kind of come and ask their kind of pay queries over the course of last year because of the transformational change we did in terms of conditions and pay framework at the BBC. And you're right, some of those have taken longer than we anticipated. I have to say that on the informal pay queries in September, we had 200 outstanding. That's now reduced to 25 outstanding. But during that time, we've had new queries come through as those new arrangements have settled with people. On the formal cases, I think you said we had some 64 at that point. What's happened is that's increased a little bit since that time, now stands at 103. So in total, we have 128 outstanding queries, and that's out of a total number of queries of some 1,299. So we've resolved more than 90%. We're still working through those.
Okay, so in total 1,299 have come in. Your numbers have gone down on informal, but your numbers on formal have gone up, I suppose, which is it's a long tail approach as it goes through the system.
And I imagine there will be people who've gone through the informal process and decide they want to then enter the formal process.
Fine, okay. So clearly your 90-day not target, you say in your policy, don't you, you're going to resolve these things in 90 days. You haven't been able to...
It's taken us longer than we anticipated. And what's important here is we get the right robust process in place to deal with them adequately. The timing has come down, so since September I think we've taken action to put in more hearing managers, and we're putting people on a full-time basis, because trying to hear these cases in addition to your day job is quite difficult. So we've found ways of speeding up the process and done things like think about the triage up front of cases, but also do intermittent reviews across a range of cases to see if we can close them a bit quicker.
Have you still got Cromer involved?
We've still got Croner involved in the form process. So Croner are the independent legal experts that have been helping us through this, and they sit on all the hearing cases of all the formal ones.
Okay. And you mentioned the new terms and conditions and career path framework. So can you assure us that that complies with equal pay legislation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've been through a very rigorous process to put in a new career path framework, and it gives a high degree of transparency for staff in terms of where they sit in that framework, and it's market informed pay ranges. And within that, what we've done is we've reduced down the number of roles from some 5,000 roles to 600. So it's a much simplified and standardised way of working. Now, some organisations do accept that they pay a spot rate for certain jobs, but we do recognise skills and experience in the rates of pay they do for the job. That doesn't mean that we fall foul of the Equalities Act, because you can pay a different rate for the same job, and we do that.
Okay, so I'm very pleased to see that the split reporting has been put in place, and so people can look and see how men and women are paid in their pay range. Was that as a result of the recommendation that we made in our report?
In relation to the we reviewed it for a number of us, and that's been helpful to get sort of feedback, and we have taken that on board.
Okay. And have you had, as a result of your introduction of split reporting, have any complaints or concerns about unequal pay being raised as a consequence, because people can now have that visibility?
We've had, through the process of looking at all the queries that we've had, we have had a number of equal pay cases which have been settled as part of that, but that's a very kind of small percentage of the whole population. Okay. And how many current equal pay tribunal cases have you got ongoing against the BBC? We have, in terms of the formal process,
beyond the formal process, as actual, a tribunal application has been lodged.
I don't think we've got any.
You haven't got any? Fine, that's good. Fine, thank you very much.
Let's just confirm that with you, though.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Philip Davis.
On the pay issue, the unacceptable gap between what men were paid and women were paid, which I think you all accept now was unacceptable. Was it your view generally that the men were being overpaid or the women were being underpaid?
Well, it's a mix of all those things. If you run an organisation, then you know that in some cases maybe underpayment of women is an issue, in some cases maybe overpayment of men, sometimes it's underpayment of men as well. What we've just been describing is bringing in rationale to the system for the generality of the people that we employ. That's the first time in a generation, and now we've brought that to our presentation teams as well, and that's why we're able to report. Plus, frankly, us keeping a focus on this, that's why we're able to report it on our over £150,000 a year presentations team. We've gone from 75% men versus 25% women 2 years ago to 55-45, and I aim to get to 50-50 by next year.
And so how many people's pay did you cut as opposed to how many people's pay did you increase?
I can't give you that figure, but the overall pay bill is down.
Right. Would it not help the gender pay gap greatly if you were to do something about Gary Lineker? And I just wondered, I mean, given that his pay is so astronomical, certainly compared to many female presenters who present on football, I just wondered what research you'd done into how many people watch Match of the Day simply because Gary Lineker is presenting it. Because I mean, I'm as big a football fan as you'll probably find, and I think I speak for many to say that I'd probably watch Match of the Day even if nobody was presenting it, to be perfectly honest, because I want to watch the highlights of the Premier League football matches. I just wondered on what basis there was for paying such an astronomical wage to it.
Well, maybe in the future AI will give us a cheap way of presenting programmes without any presenters at all. But let me just say, what's interesting about Match of the Day, or rather the Premier League, is that actually roughly 2/3 of the audiences for Premier League football are to free-to-air through the BBC, through things like Match of the Day. And Gary plays a very big part in that. And you know, as I do, that sports presentation is a very different part of the market. You know, people are paid a lot of money, much more than that, by BT, by Sky and so on, but that of course is different to public service. But Gary does a great job for the BBC. What we have also been doing though is recognising where the market doesn't play so much of an impact on news presenters and current affairs presenters, for example, where the pay for our presenters has gone down, although notwithstanding the fact we've also lost some people.
Are you suggesting that in the whole lot of the BBC and all the presenters it's got and all the rest of it, that you've got nobody who could do his job as well as Gary Lineker presenting that programme at a much lower cost, given that actually he's not a presenter, he's a former professional footballer. I'm sure you could. Are you saying there isn't the talent in the BBC to do that job just as well, keeping the same audience levels at a cheaper cost?
I am saying that I think Gary does an extremely good job for us.
You think so?
I do. And let me also tell you one thing. Over the last year, the amount that we're spending on presenters has come down by 1% as a total of our content budget, and overall it's 0.5% of the total BBC budget. And you know, we want presenters who connect with audiences, and he does.
Is it still your target to increase BAME leadership from 11.5% to 15% within a year?
I hope by the end of next year we can improve on the number of BAME people in leadership roles, and it was great to be able to celebrate Mohit as controller of Radio 4 on a board I sat last week. So that's my aim. I think it's really important from the point of view of the future of the BBC that we get diversity right in leadership, because that colours the way the organisation thinks. By the way, we're doing really well on presentation, where 20% of those over £150,000 are BAME people, and they're really good too.
And how are you achieving it?
3 ways. One is we're putting a lot of effort into leadership. One of the things which I set out at the beginning of the year that I want to change, and I think that this committee has probably heard it before, is the culture of the BBC. I really feel very strongly that what we need to offer against the big SVODs is a culture where people feel they can give of their best. We've therefore put a huge amount of stress on leadership and training up the next generation of leadership people. BAME has been candidates have been a really important part of that leadership training. So that's one thing. Second thing is we've also set ourselves a target of 2 people on both divisional boards and the executive board that I run by the end of next year. I hope we can get there, but these are targets to say we really mean business. We want to change the nature of the leadership of the BBC and the culture of the BBC.
And is there any positive discrimination involved in this, or positive action or anything like that?
No, we are doing things absolutely and properly within the law. Of course we are, but actually I want a BBC that represents the communities we serve. And by the way, that's not just in terms of BAME, it's also in terms of disability, obviously it's in terms of gender, and it's also in terms of social background as well.
And so when are we likely to see somebody from a BAME background doing your job?
You better take a judgment about that. I mean,
do you just want other people to give up their roles for BME? You don't want to do it yourself. You don't want to
Listen, I won't go into the ups and downs of my job, Mr. Davis. But no, I really want there to be good BME people on the executive board of the BBC, because actually I want an executive board in the future that represents the communities that we're seeking to serve.
And just finally, I think the last time I was on the committee, one of the last sessions I did, I was complaining to you about how you just gave your mate James Pennell a job without any proper process, nobody able to advertise it. Has that practice now ended at the BBC, that you just give your mates to give them jobs?
I remember that exchange extremely well. Well, as I just said to you, we've just had a very interesting interview panel for the Radio 4 controller. Really strong people, internal candidates too, taking part, and I think we've made an inspired choice.
So that practice doesn't operate any longer?
Well, it never operated on any large scale at all,
well,
to be honest.
Large scale, no.
Well, here we go again. But no, on this case, absolutely, I want to see competition. Of course I do.
Thank you, Simon Hart.
Thank you. Before I ask a question, can I urge you not to be too drawn into being sort of battered by sort of populist nonsense about presenters' levels of pay, because, and which leads to my question. Is there actually a magic figure amongst your viewers above which viewers think somebody is paid an unacceptably vulgar amount, and below which they think they're working hard for the BBC and providing value for money? Because if there is such a figure, it would be interesting to know it. My guess is there isn't one, because everybody has a slightly different view about what's acceptable and what isn't.
Yeah, I'm with you. No, we don't have a figure. Everybody has different views. I mean, look, when you ask people which bits of the BBC would you want to cut or don't you like, you have all sorts of different answers coming back, because people love various bits of the BBC and don't like others. That's life.
In other words, I'm sorry, Claire.
I'm sorry, I can't source it. We did do a piece of research with audiences, which we can send to you, which showed that 4 out of 5 people felt that they wanted top talent on the BBC.
Yeah.
So what we do have is evidence that actually people do want to see a range of new, but also established, and if I may say so to Mr Davis, expert presenters. So we don't just have Gary Lineker, we have Sue Barker, we have other people who've actually played a fundamental role in the country's sport, and actually audiences tend to really like that. But we don't have an answer, I think, to your specific question.
I'm pleased to hear it in a way, because for me, I would imagine your assessment would be based on value and competence and expertise.
Yes, that's right.
Not on some arbitrary populist.
It's enjoyment. Audience enjoyment.
Unlike my colleague Philip Davis, I'm not a football fan at all. But because of that, I actually value Gary Lineker, because he interprets in a way that I can understand, lacking the knowledge of my colleague to the right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A few, I think, final questions. Yeah. Is it on that? Do you want to come in on that? Or is it on something else? Okay, fine. Just on audiences, I love the cover of the annual report. It's by far the best. In the 9 years I've been reading the BBC annual report, it's definitely the best one that I've seen. And for the benefit of Hansard, there's a picture of Phoebe Waller-Bridge in Fleabag. But I think it also, apart from being a brilliant image of a very great, talented person in a great programme, I think it also masks a kind of hidden story within, which is actually, despite the success of some programmes, there is still a continuing audience shift towards older viewers, and believe that over half of viewers of BBC 1 and 2 are the 54 plus category now, and those trends are continuing. And I just wanted to ask, in the relatively short time we have in this bit of the session, is how confident are you that you can start to turn these numbers around and see more younger people watching more television?
I think a great question, and thank you for what you say about the cover. One, I think this depends on quality of programmes. At the core of it, the fact we've won 184 awards this year for not just Phoebe's programmes but for others, and 2 Emmy, we're now contenders for 2 Emmys as well. I think it's about programming. I think the fact that women's football is something we've kind of majored on, you see there both younger audiences and more general audiences coming in. I want more of that. The fact is we've got likewise cricket coming back next year again. Our aim there, working with the ECB on this new tournament, is to target younger audiences and more diverse audiences. I think that also is really important. By the way, it tells you, the weekend tells you the power of free-to-air versus, versus subscription. And if you want to grow audiences, you go free-to-air. And by the way, it's worth looking at the particular lists and so on, and opening that up again, because actually, you know, there's an issue around that. So it's about quality of output, number one. Number two, it's also about online reaches up. iPlayer is absolutely the gateway to the future. That really matters. I'm glad that after years of delay, we can now, because some of the figures for iPlayer in there show us stalling. I mean, the numbers of usages we've got of iPlayer is going up, but we're not growing the audience enough. What's just happened with Ofcom, who now I think are allowing us to go ahead and make iPlayer a destination with content up to a year and more content beyond that, is really, really important. And sounds, although you know, people have said, well, you know, is this really what you should be doing? Of course it is. It's absolutely vital. That's the future of audio in which we are really important, an important player. Beyond that, and I'm trying to keep it quite tight, beyond that, the fact that 75% or 74% of school kids use bite size, we've revamped bite size. We think bite size can be the gateway into more of our services. The fact we've put 34 million over 3 years into children's services. I was in the Commons last week to launch an app we're doing to protect children, give them protection. Again, that's future. That's important for the future. So what I'm trying to say, Chair, is that on a raft of things, starting with quality content that resonates, as Phoebe's did with Fleabag 2, through to beginning with children, that's the security for the future of the BBC. And if I have any worry, it's about the pace of the change which we need to be making. I want these things to happen quickly, and of course things like Ofcom stopping us with iPlayer for a year gets in the way.
Do you obviously the pace of change of viewing habits is dramatic, particularly to younger audiences watching online services. Do you think the BBC has got BBC Three right? I noticed in the Ofcom report published last year, reviewing your previous year, they noted that only 8% of young people watch it each week. And that seems, given this is a channel aimed at younger people, and I remember when it was previously discussed why it was shifting online, and not be, the idea was that that's where younger people watch television, but they don't seem to be watching BBC Three.
So another great question. Number one, creatively, BBC Three is on fantastic form. It's doing some really good programmes, not just the comedy or the dramas, but also the documentaries and shorts. So it really is delivering. We've started on BBC One, a sort of BBC Zone to drive, we hope, audiences to BBC Three. We're looking at ways actively now of promoting BBC Three on iPlayer, so that with recognising who's using iPlayer, you would get more BBC Three material. I think the honest answer is what we're learning is you need to use your linear channels, which, however they may decline, are nonetheless a very good gateway to taking people into the online, on-demand world, and I would expect to see more of that, and that's what we're trying to do with BBC Three.
Just finally on that for me, the slight concern I have is that the overall figures are I think quite alarming, actually, in terms of not just the BBC, but for all the linear broadcasters, about the declining younger audiences. And I'd be fascinated to know what those numbers look like if you take out sport. And certain other live events, I mean, which war weddings and things, which bring in very big audiences, and whether actually for the traditional peak audience, actually it's an even bigger shift than it looks.
Yeah. So one bit I haven't mentioned is the importance of sport, but actually the other thing I have mentioned is the importance of news. So I think it's roughly 7 out of 10 young adults use us as their news source, not always the primary source, but the source you go to find out whether something is right or not. And we're looking to, again, enhance and change how we deliver our online news services to build up that audience, because I think that's really important.
Well, I'd be interested to know what the average age profile for viewers on BBC One and Two is outside of news and sports, because I think I agree with you, those are bringing in audiences of younger people, but without that, my concern is the figures at the moment, which represent a significant challenge, could be even more challenging.
Actually, again, to answer the question, so programmes like Blue Planet 2 absolutely resonated, and for its slot beat strong competition on ITV with younger audiences. And I think that's partly because it's a programme with a kind of a message with, well put, but with which younger people could resonate. And I think I go back to the nature of our programming. What we are offering is part of the equation to stop the decline in audiences.
Thank you. Ian Lucas and then Brendan.
Thank you very much. Just picking up on the news point, actually, I attended a very interesting discussion yesterday evening with the Demos think tank about trust in news and the importance of creating trust in news. And what was interesting was that in the body of the discussion, unfortunately, the BBC didn't come up in terms of it being a forum which was commonly thought to be needed to create intelligent, impartial debate and to move away from the echo chambers that we're currently seeing in politics. Do you think that you are doing enough to create an impartial forum, which I think should be the core of your news work?
I think one of the reasons why I think this is going to sound pompous, and I really don't mean it to sound pompous, but why I think actually there's a bigger role for the BBC now than almost any other time is because I think impartiality matters. I think the word you use, Mr. Lucas, which is trust, also matters. Where do you go in a world of fake news or misinformation? Where do you go to, not just in this country but globally? We did an amazing job in the Indian elections with money got from George Osborne actually to expand what we do in Delhi in terms of calling out fake news there. I mean, a brilliant job by the teams. But come back to this country, we want to build on our trusted, as a trusted source of news in this country. And I think, if I'm sort of echoing what you're saying in a way, I think background and context, the why, not just the what, really, really matters. And that's why we've introduced a number of things like reality check and so on to try to give people the why and just not the what.
Do you think you're achieving that? The reason I made that point was I'm not sure.
So I think there is always more to do, and I think your question is a good prod to us to make sure that's what we are delivering. I think the second thing I want on news to deliver is also more local. Our local democracy reporting scheme, 150 journalists are uncovering news stories. I think it's an amazing work that with collaboration we're doing with the local press. I think as local radio, commercial local radio pulls out of local markets, and so does the press constrain itself, then I think it's a really important role we've got to ensure that local democracy is working well.
Thank you. If I start actually on local democracy, I appreciate that budgets are tight in the regions, but do you think it's sustainable in a kind of world of fast-moving news that most of the regional Sunday politics shows are recorded on a Friday, with when a lot could have happened. Certainly in this day and age, a lot happens between Friday and Sunday morning. Do you think actually, credit to the journalists who do a great job producing those programmes, it would be better if the budget was there to make them run on Sundays? And
it will be if there's an emergency, because if something happens that changes, we do some programmes, then we'll redo them live. I mean, the question that I'm now addressing with the news teams is how we ensure that our coverage in September, October, when Parliament comes back with a new government, how we're matching the challenges of that. But
in principle, I mean, subject to the funds being available, do you think those format shows on Sunday morning should go back to being live in the regions?
I don't necessarily think that. I mean, I think if there's a need because a story has moved or changed or something is happening, then I think that's right. If not, I think recording is fine.
Yeah, I suppose the trouble, as you know, well, anyone else, the political news cycle often is, breaking news on Sunday is quite a normal part of the routine. And a lot of that is to do with Andrew Marr and the excellent programme he runs on Sunday morning, to which we are really grateful. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you. I'd be interested on your assessment of the first year of the new BBC Scotland channel, how you think it has gone. Are you happy with the figures and the reach that it has achieved?
I am pleased with it. I think for it to be the #1 digital channel in Scotland after the big bruises of BBC, ITV and so on is an impressive achievement. A 3% share or thereabouts is an impressive achievement. I'm also, and I watch it a bit, a fair bit, as much as I can, I'm also seeing something which, the quantitative measures never tell you about, and that's the qualitative things, which are like finding new talent, finding new programme formats. I've been really impressed. I mean, my latest find is The Farm. For those of you who don't watch it, is a Perthshire farmer who has a real comic streak, and it's really, really good. He wouldn't have found space anywhere before BBC Scotland was set up. So as an additional channel for Scotland, I think it's doing really well, and I think they've made a really, really good start. But you probably watch did a great deal and will have some thoughtful points to make.
No, I agree with you that the quality. I'm delighted at the quality. I'm frankly astonished at the quality, given the battle we had last year about funding, and I'm sure that's something that we will return to over the years. I mean, they really are making quite an incredible job on a shoestring budget. Now, my concern would be, and you can see it already with elements of the press in Scotland, perhaps predictably egged on by their cheerleaders who have this channel in their sights about audience share, about reach. So how secure is this channel? What guarantees can you give this channel looking to the future?
It's secure. I think it's doing a great job. I think the team have done an amazing job on the resources that they have got. And I'm really glad that we're in agreement. I think what they're doing creatively and the people they're finding and the programmes they're finding is remarkable. And by the way, I include the 9 in that. I think it's a really good news programme. And so I'm a big fan and supporter.
I mean, we will continue to cross swords in terms of the budget and finances. Yeah. I absolutely guarantee you of that. Yeah. And to the delight of many on this committee, high-end drama the production has moved to Wales. But what is BBC doing to assist the development of high-end drama in Scotland?
Yeah, so we have a commissioner who is working with BBC Scotland. I think we are making commitments, beyond the very excellent Shetland and other things that we are doing. We're taking very seriously the growth of the creative economy in Scotland and our role in that, and I think BBC Scotland is helping that too.
Okay. And finally, Donald McKinnon floated a really interesting idea about the idea of a second radio service for Scotland. At the moment, Radio Scotland tries to be all things to all people, and there just isn't enough room in the shelf for everything that it wants to do. And her idea was there would be a new sports speech-based channel, and on another channel, music, culture, arts. What are your thoughts on that idea? I think it's a really interesting idea. And is it a goer?
I think it's a really interesting idea. Donalda, I think, is a great creative leader. She's always got good ideas, and indeed has been doing all of our work on gender and pushing us on the sort of employer we are for women. So she's even more than the day job, as it were. I think it's a really interesting idea. My focus and her focus and Kenny Macquarie's focus this year, and I suspect for next year as well, is on making sure BBC Scotland is in fine shape. And my view is it is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes the questions we have on the annual report. We'll take a short break and appreciate Lord Hallmark will take a short break, and then we'll have a sort of short final section on reality television. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
And for this final part of the evidence session, we will be focused on subjects related to the committee's inquiry on reality television. If I could start off perhaps to David Jordan, the written evidence the BBC has submitted to the inquiry states that the BBC editorial guidelines go further than the Ofcom code in terms of the safeguarding the duty of care of participants and setting standards for programme makers. Be interested to know why that is the case. Is it just the editorial guidelines the BBC have developed independently, and or do you feel the Ofcom code is deficient in some way?
Well, the BBC's editorial guidelines go beyond the Ofcom code in numbers of ways, because the BBC produced its editorial guidelines back in 1989 for the first time, and at that time it was based on what you might call the kind of collective wisdom of programme makers in the BBC through the decades, and it reflected what programmes did all across the BBC, brought together into one code, at that time called the Producers' Guidelines. So they've always been slightly different. And then when Ofcom came along, the guidelines were devised in a way which incorporated the Ofcom code, but those parts of what we do that went beyond the Ofcom code were retained. So, for example, we've always applied impartiality to all of our output, not just to news and current affairs, as the Ofcom code does. For example, due impartiality, that's one aspect. In relation to this particular issue, I think that we took a broader view of the duty of care than the Ofcom code does. As Ofcom's evidence to you will indicate, Ofcom's quite constrained in this area, in the sense that they have a duty of care which applies to children and to children in output, and they have a duty of care that applies to vulnerable people, and we go beyond that, and in fact we've codified that to an even greater extent in the most recent edition of the editorial guidelines, which came into effect on Monday, as it happens. And we're now talking about due care to all contributors to BBC output, which takes into that the kind of the situations which led to your inquiry, i.e. in relation to Jeremy Carl's show and to other so-called reality television programmes. So we would cover that automatically. As you know, Ofcom are now looking at whether they should change their code to be able to do the same, which it doesn't cover at the present time. It doesn't cover the general participation of adults in programmes that are governed by the Ofcom code.
Yes, there seems to be, I think, the Ofcom code, a general presumption that adults are consenting, and therefore whatever they sign up to, that's okay.
That's absolutely right. That adults are capable of making decisions for themselves, and therefore whatever trouble they get themselves into is on their own account. Whereas children and vulnerable people need special protections. I think Ofcom, in its consultation, which it announced a month or so ago, is going to relook at that. But one of the things they can take into account when they do that is the new paragraph in our own editorial guidelines, which talks about due care to all of our contributors.
And how do you ensure that the editorial guidelines are enforced, particularly when you're working with independent production companies?
Well, independent production companies have in their contract a stipulation that their programmes must be made in accordance with the editorial guidelines, just as programme and content makers throughout the BBC have in their own contracts the same stipulation. So independent contractors are held to account, but there is a process that they go through, as indeed all programme makers go through when they're making a programme for the BBC. So at the outset, the commissioning editor, whether the programme is being made in-house, independently, or by BBC Studios, will have a conversation in which there's a so-called compliance conversation. It was introduced some years ago, in which they will talk about what are the issues that may come up in this programme which need to be carefully thought about and need to be managed. And those could be any kinds of issues. They could be legal issues, they could be health and safety risks, they could be all kinds of things. But they include, do we have vulnerable contributors, or are our contributors or our contestants or others likely to be made vulnerable through participation in this programme? And they're obliged to consider that at that time, and to go on considering it through the course of the making of the programme. And then at the end, we have a compliance process which involves filling in a form for pre-recorded programs and submitting that through our systems. And those programs which have had to have risks like that managed come onto something called our managed program risk list, which we assess every month at a committee which I chair called the Editorial Standards Committee. So we have a way of keeping a check on the sorts of programs which may have issues and which we may need to manage.
So for a show like Jeremy Carl's show, where the lie detector test, as we discussed at length by ITV, is a part of the show, at the BBC, would there be a discussion at this sort of format stage of the commissioning of that programme as to how is this test going to work, how will it be used, how accurate is it, that sort of thing?
Absolutely right. And when we start up a new series or a new series of programmes, then we will have long discussions about what the issues are likely to be with that programme. And that's where me and my team get involved, usually at the outset of a series, although we will go back from time to time. And in helping to draw up the right protocols, make people think about the right issues, and then apply our editorial guidelines to whatever solutions are applicable. That's why so many of these shows, as you've seen, from asking for evidence from them, both in the independent sector and elsewhere, have these very extensive protocols now about how they will deal with people who take part in participants in their programs, which are, I think you'll agree, quite detailed. A lot of those are based on the sort of precepts that were originated in the BBC under the editorial guidelines that came from conversations and advice from my advisors.
And what sort of, for the stipulations, do you have stipulations that qualified medical professionals are there if they're required to give support to people participating in shows? Again, how do you make sure the companies are, if it's an independent production company, that they are engaging with people with the appropriate qualifications, that they are being supported in their work correctly in the workplace?
Yeah, well, part of the advice given will be that for certain sorts of programs, not all programs obviously, but for certain sorts of programs, people need to be assessed in a variety of ways in order to make sure that they're capable of taking part in the programme, and taking part in the programme won't be to their detriment rather than to their advantage. And one of the assessments that has to be made, particularly in this modern era of social media and all of the pressures that generates, is to make sure that they're capable of withstanding those kinds of pressures, and they understand that, for example, their own lives may be raked over in the media and on social media and elsewhere, and things may be brought up which perhaps were far in the past which they don't wish to be reminded of. Those kinds of issues need to be discussed with all of the individuals who take part in programmes. So a very extensive process has gone through for the highest profile and most challenging programmes, in which they're talked to about the issues that they may have. They fill in a form to give an indication of what sort of person they are, and they talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or somebody with the correct qualifications to talk to them, who then report back to the programme about whether or not, in their opinion, these people are capable of withstanding the kinds of pressures that are part of any programme that's going to be shown on television to a big audience. And then those assessments are made by the programme team as to whether those people are suitable. That's what happens at the initial stages. There are then further stages as you go through the programme and you go through to the actual transmission, and then the aftercare process to make sure that they're looked after right through the entire process.
Have there ever been shows where there have been concerns about the way it's been made, or about the concept itself, where as a consequence it's been escalated within the BBC, or maybe even escalated to the Director General as Editor-in-Chief, because there may be concerns about the format and the way the show works?
I don't recall, the Director General may recall one. I don't recall one of these getting up as far as the Director General for a decision. I think that the decisions are made lower down the organisation about what kind of show is appropriate for the BBC, and we take a very careful look at that, and we tend, and Patrick can probably add more to this because he actually commissions a lot of these things, we tend to favour programmes that are positive in their effect on people, in their outlook. So we tend not to favour programmes which are designed to create conflict. Not competition, because competition is inevitable in some of the programmes that we have, but to create conflict and to thrive on that conflict. We'd rather do programmes that essentially are affirmative and optimistic and show people improving and doing well, and act as as incentives for other people to get involved in the kind of activity which they're involved in. And so a lot of the programmes that we produce, and Patrick knows more about this than I do, are very, very successful at engendering interest in the subjects which they tackle. And the sewing bee, for example, which you may be aware of, fantastic, has apparently increased the number of sales of sewing machines by an exponential number. You know, and that's a kind of typical. Yeah, that's
every time there's a series of sewing bee, there is a spike in the number of sewing machines sold.
So I mean, Singer or whoever it is have a great debt to the BBC on that. But you know, that's as far as we're concerned, a good outcome to these kinds of programs, that we're getting people interested, and the point of doing the programs in the way that we do them in this accessible format is to try to engender interest in the subject matter and to give an accessible way of people getting into those kinds of activities.
One thing that's absolutely at the centre of any programme that starts to be developed, the two questions that we would always ask are, who are the contributors and are they going to benefit, or is this not this cannot be to the detriment of these contributors? And the secondly, what is the purpose? And that can sound like quite a worthy aspiration, but actually the great shows, the great constructed factual shows that have developed on BBC Two, on the BBC over the last years, have always had a great sense of purpose at their core. So Bake Off started on BBC Two, Sewing Bee, as David said, began on BBC Two, Race Across the World is a new format that was launched on BBC Two. And when that idea first came to us, the question was, well, why would we do a programme which is a race format? Why is that something? And actually the way in which the editorial was described, that this was a challenge show, but it was a show that challenged us not to use our mobile phones, not to fly in planes, to try and use our wits, to try and use our interaction with people along the way, to see what the sort of skills that we might have as travellers trying to get from A to B that might have been forgotten over the last 20 years, where there's more and more transatlantic or global travel, where there's that expectation that we just arrive in destinations rather than understand what it might be like to travel through. And so a show like that starts to get developed on BBC Two, rather than trying to think, well, who would we put into that programme who might look a fool or might come unstuck as a result of it. The question that we ask at the BBC is, how's the audience going to understand what the challenges of travel are? Well, we want to see people who've got skills. We want to see people who've got skills and who've got different ways of overcoming some of the natural obstacles that they would have as they travel from London to Singapore in that particular format. And similarly with Sewing Bee, there's no, when an idea is developed like Sewing Bee, you want an idea that is, you want people to come, contributors to come to that process who are skilled sewers, because otherwise the audience isn't going to benefit and the individuals concerned aren't going to benefit. So there is a natural coming together of purpose and entertainment and insight, which I think, you know, all cut to our core values.
Yeah. Do you think it's funny for me? I mean, one thing that is absolutely abundant to us is that reality shows have common traits in that they have their stars are members of the public on the whole, but they're very different in their scope. I mean, much as I love it, I would say probably The Apprentice is very much an entertainment programme. Certainly, I'd say the early rounds, one where conflict is quite a big part of it. How do you make sure that the program, that the right line is trod there between having a show which is based on a competition format where the contestants are competing against each other for a prize, but also it's also an entertainment program as well, and the entertainment the entertainment comes from the contestants, not always in ways which they would like. I mean, how do you make sure that the program makers get that balance right between creating a show that people enjoy watching and making sure that some people aren't being portrayed in a ridiculous way in order to make it entertaining?
I think that it's interesting that The Apprentice started on BBC Two, and it started on BBC Two over 15 years ago, and that combination of purpose, of trying to find people who have got terrific business skills to succeed. Initially, it was to get a job with Sir Alan Sugar, as it was, but Lord Sugar now, and subsequently that it became an investment opportunity. Initially, you really need to, if you don't, in terms of the contributor contributors that come to the programme, if they're not people who are going to succeed in business and have the skills to become successful entrepreneurs, then that's a bit of a barrier to entry. So the first thing in terms of business credibility or business aspirations is so important. So the individuals have to have that level of skill, belief, interest, excitement, but also you are looking for individuals who are willing to share what they're thinking. If people are very private, reserved individuals that are not going to take part in group activities, that don't understand the dynamic of the team, I mean, as you suggest, that as the series develops, it's always the team ethic that takes over. It's the individuals who are able to operate within a team, who are able to galvanise that team to a shared goal, are the ones that thrive. And so that has to be at the heart of the process when contributors are being selected. But obviously, you want contributors who are going to be enjoyable to watch. So you want to find individuals who have got the personality, the desire to succeed.
It's interesting because when I remember visiting Bake Off before it departed our shores, the cause and effect was not there. But what really struck me about talking to the team was how the people who were taking part in Bake Off were there because they loved baking, and second, because it was on TV. And I think that sort of equation is really important in deciding how these programs work, isn't it?
So I know that it's an entertaining program, but don't underestimate the serious outcomes that occur as a result of that program.
Indeed, Katie Hopkins being one.
In terms of people doing incredibly well subsequently out of having been on it, and that there was, I think it's right in saying that the first one of them to have £1 million turnover in their business, it happened just the other day. I mean, they go on to become serious entrepreneurs, and in many cases. So it does have a serious business purpose by identifying people who are likely to succeed, as well as obviously being an entertaining programme to watch.
A quick question from Brennan O'Hara, then Gillian Wright.
Just on the way that The Apprentice has shifted, that business credibility. 15 years ago, any one of the 15 could have emerged, and it was a genuine competition. Now you're watching The Apprentice and you get the impression that people have been specially selected for their large personalities rather than their business acumen. And is that a deliberate shift, or is that a consumer-led shift? Because you can't really argue that the criteria which applied 15 years ago is the one which applies now.
I mean, I think that the world has changed a lot in 15 years. The desire for young people to become entrepreneurs has increased exponentially over that amount of time. So there's individuals who maybe 15 years ago that the only pathway into business would be seen to be a straight office job or to be sort of like work your way through, whereas now, I mean, I don't look after The Apprentices on BBC One rather than Two, so I haven't got the specifics of individual candidates.
You take the point, though, that if the contestants in The Apprentice, it's like, I don't know, Love Island, it can count. They are, you know what I mean?
I hope so.
I mean, no offence to people on Love Island. They are thinking nothing of parading about in their I mean, how they find the time to become entrepreneurs when they clearly spend half their life in the gym, I don't know. But the point I'm making is that it's become more of a personality. It's become more of that sort of tune in to see what so-and-so does outrageous next week rather than what it was at the beginning. And what I'm asking is that producer-led or is that consumer-led, that change?
I think that, I'm not sure if I agree that there has been that seismic change. I mean, as there was a series a few years ago where Ricky Martin won the series. He was a wrestler. He was someone who wrestled in his spare time, which one would think sort of detracted from his credibility. And he went on to win The Apprentice, and he's now running a multi-million pound, I mean, David's just mentioned his business, as a recruitment consultant. So The Apprentice is at its very best when an individual comes into it and learns through the process, because the audience loves seeing that learning and loves seeing those individuals grow, learn. And it is, there are all ages can apply to be in the show, But there are lots of young, aspiring entrepreneurs that want to be in the show. I think the world has changed quite a bit in those 15 years in terms of what young people value, in terms of body image, in terms of the money they spend on clothes, the desire to, as we all know from social media, in terms of what body image and self-image means. So I do think that has factored into the individuals who apply to be in the show.
Thank you. Julian Lloyd.
Thank you. I actually once met the President of Mongolia, and he was actually a wrestler. So, top office is not. Just in terms of, just David Jordan, just to clarify for me, please, just in terms of what the Chair asked you before, when you start thinking and discussing putting systems in place for ensuring good duty of care, is it at the genesis of the idea? Is it in production? Is it post-production? What is the point? And is your way of doing things the norm across the industry?
It's difficult for me to answer the second part of that question because I just don't have total sight of what everybody else
I'll put
does.
that to Mr. Holland and Mr.
But I, so you'll probably learn more from the other witnesses that you're taking about what happens in the rest of the industry. But just looking at the protocols in independent companies that work for the BBC, it's clear that a lot has been learned out of the sessions that I was talking about in discussing programmes at their outset. The answer to the first part of your question is yes, the discussions take place at the outset, but after the idea has been formed. So probably after it's been commissioned by someone like Patrick, or at least is being considered for commissioning, so that it's a serious candidate. You would have the conversations at that stage about what the implications might be for the kinds of people that you want to have take part. And that's when you would think about all the potential issues, the potential problems that might occur, and set up systems to deal with them. And that's where all the protocols originate from.
I'll go on to the second part of the question in a second with the journalists. I just want to follow up just for a second. So effectively this is when you get these sort of serious candidates. And at that point, do you think about things like, for example, whether or not there needs to be psychiatric support, that sort of thing? And do you, because we had the psychiatrist or psychologist involved with the Jeremy Kyle show, very affable but clearly quite clueless when it came to that particular, how the show actually was really operating. How do you verify the qualifications? How do you ensure that those who are working on the programmes are actually the right staff?
Well, we have an in-house qualified psychologist who works for the Safety, Security and Resilience team in the BBC, which deals with a whole lot of issues ranging from sending people into conflict zones through to these kinds of things. And she vets the qualifications of all the people that we will approve to be either psych helps in any of these programmes, and keeps a list of those that we've approved so that programmes can get access to them. So we have a qualified professional looking at the qualifications of other qualified professionals, and not just their qualifications, but also the experience that they have across the industry, what they've done elsewhere, and what experience they can bring to bear. Because some of the people that we use on some of our shows have done literally dozens and dozens of programmes and have built up a huge body of knowledge over the time about what the issues are that they might confront. Clearly, the more that you've done it, the more likely you are to be able to offer assistance and help to anybody who's going through difficult situations in relation to the programme that they've appeared on, and to be able to offer the right kind of advice about how to cope with them. So we have experienced people who are vetted by our in-house team and to make sure that they are qualified to do the job.
How much power do you actually have, though, when it comes to when ideas come in front of you, any treatments that come in front of you at this stage, these serious candidates you're describing? Can you say, oh my goodness, red light here, this really is something which is frankly too awful to put on air, this needs to be... Have you actually done that?
I have on occasion gone to the Director General and said, I don't think this is something the BBC should be doing. And that's rare. It's rare for me to have to go to the Director General to do that. Usually, if I come along and say to a senior executive in commissioning that I think this programme certainly can't be doable in the form that it's been suggested, usually you try to offer creative solutions that will allow it to be done in some other way. But if I go along and say that to a senior executive, they're going to take that very, very seriously. It's rare for them not to agree with what I say in those circumstances. That doesn't, I have to say, happen very often. It's a rare occurrence, but people do take it very seriously. I report directly to the Director General, and they know that I speak with his authority.
And is there a sharp difference between those which you are buying, effectively, production you're buying in rather than production which is more sort of centralised?
I'm not sure I know what you're getting at.
Well, what I'm saying is that some of the issues that have obviously the BBC has had in the past have been to do with programmes that effectively are effectively bought in.
Yes.
Yeah, and that is that more problematic for you? In
Well,
this space?
I mean, the biggest problem in my job is the Donald Rumsfeld problem, which are what are the sort of unknown unknowns, as it were. So yes, that's always an issue. Things that we talk about and work through and decide in advance are much easier to make sure that they go correctly than things that are happening that you don't know about.
Mr. Holland, sort of returning to the second part, the first question, if you like, in terms of are these things normal across the industry? You'll have scope in terms of what actually goes on with competitors and across the TV industry. Is it normal to have this level of early engagement in terms of duty of care?
I think that I can't speak for, it's a long time since I made a programme for ITV or Channel 4, so what I would say about the BBC is that those duty of care conversations are not added on. They're not conversations that you think, oh, I better have the duty of care conversation because we haven't had it. When you are commissioning a programme which is potentially vulnerable contributors that are going to be involved in that programme, then one of the first questions that we would ask at BBC Two and at the genre level as well, in terms of the head of factual, the controller of factual would ask the same question, would be, have we spoken to editorial policy? Have we spoken to someone in David's team about that programme? Not because they're the police, but because they are fantastic advisors. And in terms of what are the challenges, to take an example, there was a programme we had on last year called We Are British Jews. And the idea that was pitched to us was, what would the major questions facing British people who are of Jewish descent, whether they're practicing Jews or whether they're secular Jews, in terms of the twin massive debates about anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism, and what's happening in Israel and the occupied territories. And so that's a very powerful idea. It raises huge numbers of problems in terms of, if you were to see those issues from the point of view of an ordinary person, if you're a person who's an audience member coming and being involved in that programme, that presents huge challenges. So the advice of David's team in terms of what are the protocols, what are the conversations that we're having with those individuals, what will the social media response potentially be, how will that individual or group of individuals be managed through the filming process, which could be quite distressing, through the production process, where family, friends and other people might start raising questions about their involvement. How do we deal with the press involvement as it builds towards transmission? How do the social media team involve themselves in terms of the response? So there is advice, editorial advice, which is baked into a protocol across that whole production that takes you to transmission and beyond, because the social media response to programmes, we're seeing social media response to benign programmes like University Challenge extraordinary in comparison with what was happening 5 years ago. So there is that ongoing duty of care. A duty of care is not a box to tick. It is a process that begins with the commission of the programme and doesn't end until, there are programmes still on iPlayer where commissioning editors are in contact with executive producers at production companies about individuals, and is that programme still okay to keep on iPlayer, and are the contributors still happy with that programme on iPlayer? And that happens all of the time, because that, once you enter into those partnerships with contributors, then that is an ongoing relationship.
It's a really interesting point there, because you mentioned University Challenges, and so a lot of young people, that sort of thing. And it looks like great fun, but there's an awful lot of social media maelstrom around it. Sometimes you get someone messing up a question or a team that underperforms, and the sort of brutality of some of the language you find on social media. do we actually have a real scope? Because we know Joe McCall is quite obvious reality TV. The Apprentice, quite obviously reality TV. Are we sort of missing a point here that actually reality TV is a lot broader scope than we would think? Would you, for instance, think in terms of news-related or current affairs as well, having a reality TV aspect to it and needing that same duty of care? Where does the line start and where does it start and stop?
No, I wouldn't draw the thing as much. I mean, I think that reality TV has always been an ironic title of certain programs, because actually the reality TV programs, in the pure sense, are not reality. They're constructed reality, or the reality that's interfered with. They're not actually reality, so they can't be compared with an observational documentary or a piece of news. Obviously, all television is to some extent a construct, or whatever it is, but in reality TV shows have a very, very highly constructed aspect to them, which is not found in news. They're not attempting actually to depict reality. They're attempting to heighten reality or to do other things to it rather than to depict reality itself. So I think it is very, very different from making news and making current affairs and making most sorts of factual programs, certainly observational documentaries, all of those kinds of things. I don't think they come anywhere near that. There is an issue about where precisely the end of reality television is, that's in relation to the kinds of programs that Patrick was just talking about, and which we mentioned in our submission, which are kind of immersive programs, as we call them. I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. Does it extend into that territory? I wouldn't personally say that it actually extends into competitions and the like, because they're a pretty well-defined different kind of program. But The Apprentice would be, it's an interesting question as to what extent that's constructed in a way. But I would make the construction of it the key issue if I was looking at it from your perspective.
Are we in danger, though, effectively, of broadening the scope of reality to such an extent? You've been included on the University Challenge, Race Across the World, the Family Brain Game, that sort of thing, those sort of programmes. They have a strong aspect of reality within them and interaction. Does that mean that they need that same duty care? They need those same systems in place, those same sort of route map? Or actually, do we just say, okay, well, we'll just stick this all just for these particular programmes, the Apprentice World, etc. These actually basically are sort of game shows and off you go.
I think that from programme making and from a commissioning point of view, that where members of the public, where the audience are involved in that programme, whether it is something which is a quiz, or whether it is something which is a really involved piece of factual entertainment like the Apprentice, that we have a duty of care. I mean, our duty of care is to all contributors, but what the protocol is for each of those individual programmes is obviously different. With University Challenge, what's changed is that the conversation with potential contestants about what could happen is a much more, is a formal conversation now. That didn't happen 5-10 years ago, because the social media response to a quiz featuring young people celebrating their knowledge was not quite so poisonous as sometimes it is today. So the contributors to that programme need to be alerted to that, but there aren't some of the other issues that might turn up in a programme like We Are British Jews, which is far more involved and far more nuanced and far more, throws up lots and lots of other questions. So I think that we as commissioners develop protocols which are very different and nuanced for the different shows that we commission.
Just one final question, if I may, just to Lord Hall, in terms of just take a top-down viewpoint, if you like, about the BBC and how it interacts in this space over reality TV. Is there certain aspects? I mean, let's have a look at one program. We'll have Channel 5 can't pay, let's take it away. Is that something you never see on the BBC? Where is the BBC in terms of its values and in terms of being able to effectively sort of draw a line over where reality TV, the scope, the way in which reality TV, the lengths to which it goes to?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a difficult question. To my mind, it goes back to what both David and Patrick have been talking about, which is what's the purpose? And I think what's the purpose of the programme is a question that we in the BBC should keep asking. And then the second part of that is, and how do we use the people within that programme in an affirmative, not cynical way? So I think I would approach most questions of what is a BBC programme by saying, where does it start? What's its starting off point? We're not doing something to kind of poke fun at people or whatever it happens to be. This is actually because it's got a very clear purpose, and we're going to treat people properly. Which is why the second point I'd make before deciding on whether I thought a programme was a BBC programme or not, it actually goes back to what I think does differentiate the BBC, which is the amount of care and thought that goes into every stage of the process, from the commission right the way through to transmission, and even beyond that, as you've been hearing, if something then is sitting on iPlayer. And the guidelines just published, which are there, that thick, multicoloured book. What's really interesting, when you talk to, because your point to Patrick is, so what does the rest of the industry look like? What's really interesting, talking to other European broadcasters in the EBU, is how many others look to that as a kind of, okay, we'll build our the quality standards on that, and which is really interesting, and is very flattering to the work that David and his team do.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to say that when I was on University Challenge, social media wasn't something we had to worry about that much. But Ian Lucas.
Would you mind if I just asked a follow-up on Julian's question?
Okay.
Just a quick one. I just wondered, because I thought it was a really interesting question. I just wondered if there were any examples of programmes that were touted to you that you rejected on grounds of that you didn't think it was acceptable, that had ended up on another channel somewhere. And if that had happened, and if you had any examples of that.
I can't think of anything that I've been told about. Can you?
I'm not sure. I mean, there are examples, but I'm not sure whether we can say them without without damaging the. We could write it. There are examples. There are some examples.
Other approaches.
That'd be very interesting, even if it was on a confidential basis. Thank you.
Sorry.
Sort of actually, what I'm going to ask is sort of picks up on this thread, because it's been very interesting to listen to you, because it contrasts markedly with the evidence that we've heard from the other public sector broadcasters who've given us evidence. And it's very striking that you have already in place systems which I think, certainly I would like to see in place with other public sector broadcasters. And it seems extraordinary that you should have them and they don't. So my question is that linked to a commercial issue? Is it linked to the fact that you get your income from licence fee payers rather than are commercially driven?
That's a good question. Look, I think it is because of who we are, and I think people expect, you all expect a very high standards from the BBC. That means that we put so much stress on David's area and then our commissioning teams to produce programmes that we want. I think the fact we have 5 public purposes also helps, but is key to what we commission, what we do, what we broadcast, the shows that we do. But I think more broadly than that, I think it's in everybody's interest to do programmes that are, properly thought through, properly worked out in advance, and people are properly dealt with. So that's a question for others, not for me. But I just think acting decently is fundamental to how we should be as broadcasters.
Because I think your question, what is the purpose of this programme, was a question that someone who made Benefit Street should ask, someone who made Jeremy Carr Show should ask. And I think maybe if they had, we may not be doing this inquiry.
We had a programme on BBC Two last year called The Mighty Red Car, which asked the question.
Yeah, I know very well.
Asked the question.
Very good programme.
As it was pitched, we said, "Well, how are you going to make a series about the young people of Redcar, which empowers them and doesn't demonise them, and yet at the same time is interesting and engaging for a broad audience?" And the response was The Mighty Red Car, which was a very it was celebratory, but without being, you know, it was voiced by the individuals from the town. And in terms of exploring the issues of what it's like to be a young person in that town when the steelworks had closed, and the question about should I stay or should I go in terms of what's my future was all pertinent. You could have made quite a drab documentary about that. It could have been quite a, or it could have been quite a sensationalist documentary. And I think that the series that the team at 72 Films made was a remarkably life-affirming, and at the same time still was able to tackle real issues in terms of unemployment and recidivism of offenders. So I think that all comes from being able to ask the question, why are we doing it, and what's the purpose of doing it, and what's the impact going to be for those contributors.
I was trying really hard to think of a BBC programme I could take you to task on in this area, and haven't been able to think of one. So, thank you.
We'll get back to you if we do. I think that concludes the questions from the committee. Thank you very much, and particularly Lord Hall, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended.